have the weapons and know where to use them. The might of the United Nations will hearten our friends and will destroy our foes.
This is America. Don't got you slipping now. Look how I'm living now. Police be tripping now. Yeah, this is America. Guns in my area.
My area?
I got the strap. I gotta carry 'em. This is America. Don't catch you slipping now. Don't catch you slipping now. Look what I'm whipping now. This is America. Don't catch you slipping now. Don't catch you slipping now.
Alright, what's going on, guys? Yeah, it's been a minute. Anyways, I know y'all read the title of the video. Today, we're gonna be going over every single American war. Yeah, we're gonna start off from like 1775 to present day. But of course, before we get started with today's video, I have to announce that this video is sponsored by here's the format of what everything's gonna look like. I've got like the date set up. We're gonna see who's the president at the time. I'll be able to show, you know, who's on whose side. And yeah, I mean, y'all get the gist. I mean, y'all are smart. Everything is gonna go on like a flat timeline, so be aware that like one war could start in 1 year and another war can end in that same year. So I'm gonna have a number count of like ongoing conflicts and shit at the bottom right hand corner of the screen, just so you have an idea of like everything that's going on in that time frame. But you know what, without further ado, let's, you know, just fucking jump right into it. All right, so first off, we're gonna be starting with the American Revolutionary War that began in 1775, and we pretty much know the basics of all this shit that went down. Cliff Notes version, basically. It started with the Currency Act of 1764, and that pissed off like all the colonists because it prevented them from issuing their own currency. And another factor would be the French and Indian War, which cost the British like a lot of money. So they were like, you know what, we need our money back. Let's tax these colonists. Colonists were pissed off, bro. So they went to Boston and just, you know, said fuck your tea, dumped all their tea and that shit. And British were pissed off after that, so they put the Intolerable Acts, which was basically, bro, I'm not gonna go through like every single one, but it was just a load of bullshit. All right, after the Intolerable Acts were passed, the First Continental Congress would be formed, and it was just a back and forth between the colonists and the British until the Battle of Lexington and Concord signaled the beginning of the revolution, bro. Now the next year in 1776, the Cherokee American Wars would begin. And basically how this started was after the French and Indian War, the British government issued a royal proclamation that set like a boundary line, and it was called the Indian Boundary, and it stopped American settlers from crossing into the Appalachian and other regions. And as part of the laws surrounding the proclamation, the British government actually recognized the rights of certain Native American nations to drive white settlers from their territory, and would even send troops of their own to stop colonists from like passing over the borders. However, this didn't really stop Americans from crossing into Cherokee territory, and that would only make shit worse. And this would lead to skirmishes, which would evolve into the Cherokee American Wars. Now, in 2 years, in 1778, you get the Battle of Wyoming, or what is called the Wyoming Massacre. So yeah, I will be including like small conflicts and most importantly like massacres, and this one just happened to take place during the American Revolution. And basically what happened, a group of British loyalists accompanied by Iroquois raiders would get into a skirmish with American patriots, and yeah, more than 300 people were killed, and the patriots ended up losing this battle. And afterwards, like 30 or 40 of them were literally like tortured to death, bro. Like, this shit gets crazy, man. Now, 4 years after that, in 1782, we'd get the Gnadenhutten Massacre, which was a killing of like 100 Moravian Christian Native Americans that were mostly Lenape and Mohican by U.S. militiamen from Pennsylvania. And basically what happened was the Moravian Christians didn't want to take sides during the American Revolution, and this caused them to be like seen as suspicious by both the British and Americans. So while these Native Americans were collecting crops, Pennsylvania militia basically encountered them and lied to them and told them that they would be relocated away from any conflicts that would bring the American Revolutionary War to them. So they were gathered together, and once they were all rounded up, they executed them. A militia dragged women and girls out of their village and raped them and killed everybody. So yeah. The next year, in 1783, the American Revolution would officially end. Long story short, the British would eventually surrender in Yorktown in 1781, and a treaty would be officially signed in 1783. If you actually just want the full story on the American Revolution, you could probably just, watch Hamilton. And yeah. 2 years after that, the Northwest Indian War would begin in 1785, and basically land initially known as the Ohio Country and Illinois Country. Illinois. I'm sorry for saying Illinois, all right? Illinois. Y'all don't have to fucking keep telling me. God damn. Illinois. Here we go. This Illinois Country was granted to the United States by the Kingdom of Great Britain in one of the articles from the Treaty of Paris in the previous year, and basically Great Britain had given away land that had belonged to lots of Native American peoples that, were living there. When European Americans began settling in these regions, a Huron-led confederacy formed in 1785 to resist the taking of the Native American lands, and they basically declared that it was all their territory. And this basically led George Washington to enforce U.S. sovereignty over the territory, and a war would officially begin in 1785. Now, the next year in 1786, Shays' Rebellion would go down, and basically what that was an armed uprising in the western Massachusetts and Worcester areas in response to like a debt crisis among everybody. And it was also in opposition to the state government's increased efforts to collect taxes both on individuals and their trades. People were pissed, man. These veterans, it was basically like a whole group of American Revolutionary War veterans. And they were like, bro, we just got done fighting this war against the crown due to taxes, and now our own state government is going to impose these taxes on us. What the fuck is this? They were pissed. And in 1787, the rebels would march on the Springfield Armory in an unsuccessful attempt to seize its weapons and overthrow the government. And this rebellion was eventually put down by the Massachusetts state militia and a privately funded local militia, and all that would be laid to rest, bro. 4 years after that, in 1791, the Whiskey Rebellion would begin, and what had happened was a whiskey tax was imposed on whiskey by the federal government, and people were pissed. And in several regions, whiskey was served as like a medium of exchange, and people were like, no, we're not fucking paying taxes on that, bro, no. Many of the resistors were, again, like war veterans, just like in Shays' Rebellion, who believed that what they originally had fought against, taxation without representation, was literally happening again. So yeah, this would start in 1791. 2 years later, in 1793, the Northwest Indian War would officially end. People would stop fighting around 2 years later in 1795, but the United States and Great Britain negotiated the Jay Treaty, which required British withdrawal from all the regions that they had given to them in the Treaty of Paris, and this also opened up some British territory in the Caribbean for American trade. The treaty also encoded free trade and freedom of movement for Native Americans living in the territories that were either controlled by the United States or Great Britain. So it was basically like, you guys started this war, the United States and Great Britain would come together, just be like, nah, let's just find a way to end this shit. And yeah, the Native Americans would just get pushed out of their land anyways. It's that's how it went down, bro. It'd be like that sometimes. The next year, in 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion would end, and leading up to this, throughout the western Pennsylvania counties, protesters would use like violence and intimidation to prevent federal officials from collecting taxes on whiskey, and everything would climax in 1794. A marshal would arrive in Pennsylvania to hold the people who are not paying taxes accountable, and an alarm was raised, and more than like 500 people attacked the home of a tax inspector named John Neville, and George Washington would send peace commissioners to Pennsylvania to negotiate with the rebels, while at the same time calling on governors to mobilize a militia force just in case. And at the end of the day, he had like 13,000 dudes. So yeah, that kind of crushed the rebellion. There was no fighting. The rebels all went home, and like 20 people were arrested, but they all got pardoned anyway. So in the next year, in 1795, the Cherokee American Wars would end. Fighting would eventually like die down, and tensions would still be very, very high. Yeah, you could imagine. Now, 3 years later, in 1798, we get the Quasi War, and basically what this was just like an undeclared naval war that was fought between the United States and France. Okay, so at this point, the U.S. had owed France money, and after the French Revolution, they were basically like this: no, we don't owe you guys money because the king that we had actually owed money to had died, so we don't owe you that money anymore. And France was like, oh, you don't want to pay up? We're just going to take your shit. And yeah, they started intercepting goods from merchant vessels. The U.S. got mad, and the Quasi War would last about 2 years, and it would all end in 1800. Now, a year after the Quasi War would end, in 1801, we'd get the First Barbary War. And basically how the U.S. got involved, pirates from Barbary states were seizing American merchant ships and holding the crews for ransom. President Thomas Jefferson would refuse to pay the tribute, and eventually fighting would break out, and around like 100 people would get killed. And a treaty was eventually signed on June 10th, 1805, and the U.S. agreed to pay a ransom of $60,000 for American prisoners, and this was also considered tribute to the Barbary states. And yeah, the war would end after that. Now, about 5 years later, in 1810, Tecumseh's War would begin, and this was a conflict between the United States and Tecumseh's Confederacy. And basically, Tecumseh was outraged about this outcome of a treaty called the Treaty of Fort Wayne, in which Miami and Eel River tribal leaders signed and ceded away 3 million acres of land in Ohio, Illinois. This started a big divide. Like, all this would like lead to the War of 1812, but tensions would continue to rise, and when the United States heard about the formation of Tecumseh's Confederacy, they decided to organize an army together to lead a preemptive strike against them. And Tecumseh's brother would actually come across this army, and they would fight. That would be the first fight of the war. Now, later that year, in 1811, we'd get the German Coast Uprising, and this was known as one of the largest uprisings in U.S. history. And basically, between like 100 and 130 enslaved men would march from sugarcane plantations towards the city of New Orleans, and they collected more men along the way. And some accounts said that there were like 500 enslaved people that had participated. And during their 20-mile march, they would burn around 5 plantation houses and sugar houses and crops. In response, a militia was formed to fight them, and they lost. The militia would defeat them, and over the next 2 weeks, many slaves would be interrogated and just executed. And a lot of people who had been captured, actually, they had their heads chopped off, and their heads were put on pikes to intimidate any of the other slaves. But yeah. The next year, in 1812, the War of 1812 would begin, and how it all started was because Britain was at war with France, and Britain had enforced a naval blockade of Napoleonic France and its allies, and this pissed off neutral parties who wanted to trade with France, and in particular, it pissed off the U.S., and it also conscripted sailors from U.S. merchant vessels for its wartime fleet, because these people, these colonists, or I guess these U.S. citizens by now, the British were like, hey, you're not from the United States, you're from Britain. And you can't tell me otherwise. And when it comes to the Native American side point, specifically the Native American nations in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they didn't like American expansion into their lands, and they were doing everything that they could to stop this, including Tecumseh's War and campaigns of raids against American settlements. And Britain saw them as like, enemy of my enemy, my friend, so they allied with them. Yeah, the U.S. didn't like that either, and this was like the first time the United States declared war on another nation. Like, it was the first time, bro. And after that, Tecumseh's War would end in 1813, and that would all just blow over into the War of 1812. Now, the Creek War would also begin in 1813, and this was also known as the Red Stick War, and it was basically a regional war between opposing Creek factions, European empires, and the United States, and it took place in Alabama and along the Gulf Coast. So a civil war would kind of erupt between the Creeks and the Red Stick Creeks, and the United States ended up forming an alliance with the Choctaw Nation, Cherokee Nation, and the traditional Creeks. Yeah, they would join in the war to stop this rebellion of the Red Stick Creeks. And the United Kingdom, Spain, and Tecumseh's Confederacy would side with the Red Stick Creeks. From the Creek War, we would actually get the 1813 Fort Mims Massacre. And what basically happened was a force of Creek Native Americans belonging to the Red Stick faction would storm a fort and basically defeat the militia that were garrisoned there. And afterwards, everyone living there was killed, like all the settlers and the rest of the militia. It was, yeah. So right after the massacre, a lot of people from the United States were like really pissed. And General Andrew Jackson, he would actually assemble a Tennessee militia and begin to march towards this Red Stick army that had attacked Fort Mims. So while they were marching there along Coosa River, Andrew Jackson would end up ordering General John Coffee to attack a Creek village called Tallahatchie. The village was attacked, and around 200 Creek warriors would be killed, as well as women and children. And yeah. We'd also see the Taos Massacre in this war, in which General John Floyd and around 1,000 militiamen and 400 allied Creek would attack and burn down Taos village. And yeah. Now the next year, in 1814, the Creek War would end, and what had happened was Andrew Jackson had actually forced the leaders of both sides of the Creek, the Red Sticks and the traditional Creeks, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson. Yeah, that would basically end it all, and Andrew Jackson would actually force them to cede like 2 million acres of land. Traditional Creeks and the Red Stick Creeks, both, they lost their land, bro. In that same year, the War of 1812 would also end. By 1814, both Britain and the United States had either achieved their main goals or were just, tired of it all. So negotiations were concluded by December 24th of that year, and basically, they just made peace. Now the next year, in 1815, we'd have the Second Barbary War. If y'all remember the first one where we had to pay tribute to the Barbary States, there was still like an uneasy tension, and they would end up returning to attacking American merchant vessels and taking crews for ransom. And the war would basically end when the United States Senate ratified a treaty on December 5th, 1815, and after the end of the war, the United States and European nations stopped paying tribute to the Barbary States, and this marked the beginning of the end of piracy in the Mediterranean. Now, the next year, in 1816, we get the First Seminal War, and essentially this began with General Andrew Jackson's excursions into Spanish Florida against the Seminole Nation after the War of 1812. So Florida was originally owned by Spain, but there were so many uprisings and rebellions by Native American peoples and enslaved people that eventually sometimes Americans would go and fight, like General Andrew Jackson. And Spain was kind of getting tired of it all. They realized they weren't going to be able to control Florida, and since Americans were already in Florida and kind of holding it down, they agreed to cede the territory to the United States in 1819. And that would kind of end the Seminole War. There would still be, of course, skirmishes and small fights, but the United States would now control Florida. A couple of years later, in 1823, the Arikara War would happen. This took place along the Missouri River in South Dakota. So the Arikara people first came into contact with Americans when Lewis and Clark reached them in 1804, and 2 years later in 1806, an Arikara leader would actually die during a trip to the United States Capitol, and the Arikara would kind of hold tensions against the United States after that, thinking that they were involved with his death. Eventually, people would begin coming into their territory as the fur trade would grow a lot, and in the start of 1823, the Arikara attacked the Missouri Fur Company's Fort And the United States would respond by sending a force of around 300 soldiers and around 700 Sioux allies, and they would march to an Arikara village, kind of hold them under siege, and eventually the Arikara would retreat and leave the village, and the United States would come in, burn the village down, and that was the end of that war. 4 years later, in 1827, the Winnebago War would happen, and it was kind of an uprising of a Ho-Chunk Native American group of people. This mostly occurred due to the waves of miners that were entering the upper Mississippi River region, and there were just like a few skirmishes and small fights and even attacks on American civilians, and the U.S. would respond by gathering a military force, and the Ho-Chunks would eventually surrender 8 men who had actually participated in the uprising, including the ringleader named Redbird, and he would die in prison the next year while awaiting trial. And yeah, that would be the end of that. Now, 4 years after that, in 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion would happen. And this started with several entrusted fellow slaves that were with him, and he would end up enlisting over 80 enslaved and free African Americans. They ended up traveling from house to house, freeing enslaved people and killing many of the white people that they encountered there, and they would end up killing between like 50 or 60 people. However, the rebellion was ended within a few days at the Belmont plantation, and afterwards there was widespread fear among like all the people, the white people, and militias organized in retaliation, and approximately 120 enslaved people and free African Americans were killed by militias in the area. The Commonwealth of Virginia would later execute an additional 50 enslaved people who were accused of being part of the rebellion, including Nat Turner, and many people who didn't even participate were killed as well. Now, the next year in 1832, Black Hawk War would occur, and basically all of this started. Black Hawk and a group of Sauks known as the British Band would cross the Mississippi River into the U.S. state of Illinois, and the U.S. officials would be convinced that the British band was hostile, so they mobilized a militia to fight against them, and they would end up opening fire on a delegation sent by the Native Americans. That would then culminate into the Battle of Stillman's Run, and that would lead to about 12 militiamen being killed by the band. And 7 days after this, a group of about 80 Potawatomi and 3 Sauks would band together and attack a cabin belonging to William Davis. And basically, backstory, the reason this massacre happened at William Davis's cabin, mainly by the Potawatomi people, was because before the war, a dam was actually built near a small Potawatomi village, and the chief would actually go to William Davis, the man who built the dam, and said it stopped fish from reaching the village. Davis would not agree to take it down, and after the Black Hawk War started, this group would just basically ride up on his cabin and kill everybody there. There would be about 15 settlers that were killed, and this would be known as the Indian Creek Massacre. Eventually, Black Hawk and his band would be tracked down and would lose at the Battle of Bad Axe, and Black Hawk and many of the other leaders would escape, but were eventually caught and imprisoned for a year. And this whole war would basically strengthen the policy of Indian removal, in which Native American tribes were pressured to sell their lands and move west of the Mississippi River. 3 years later, the Texas Revolution would begin, and this would start around October 1835 after multiple political and cultural clashes between the Mexican government and European Americans that were living in Texas. And another factor was that the Mexican government had officially abolished slavery in 1830, and a lot of the Americans living there were like, no, we want slavery. So that kind of was a large factor leading up to this revolution. Eventually, what would happen is a whole bunch of Texans and floods of volunteers from the United States would defeat small garrisons of Mexican soldiers and declare Texas's independence. So you could kind of, at this point, see Texas as like it was kind of its own country for a little while. That same year in 1835, the Second Seminal War would begin. Okay, so basically how this all started The United States had ratified the Treaty of Payne's Landing in April 1834, and the treaty had basically given the Seminoles 3 years to move west of the Mississippi. So the United States appointed a Seminole agent named Wiley Thompson, and he was given the task of basically persuading the Seminole Nation to move. So Wiley Thompson would call the chiefs together, and he would read a letter from Andrew Jackson, who was the president at the time, that said, should you refuse to move, we're gonna have to remove you by force. And of course, this did not go over well. 5 of the most important Seminole chiefs would refuse to move, and this would just make tensions a lot worse. And the first incident of this war would be when a Seminole War party would capture a Florida militia supply train, killing most of the guards and taking the goods. And some of these Seminole War parties would go around to sugar plantations along the coast of St. Augustine and destroy them and free the slaves. And most of the enslaved people would then go on to join the Seminole Nation. Now, the next year in 1836, the Texas Revolution would end. On officially March 1836, the Republic of Texas would declare independence. And while fighting would ultimately cease, Mexico would still refuse to recognize the Republic of Texas because it was like they had it first. So as the years would go by, there would still be small conflicts and fights along the border. 4 years later, in 1840, the Comanche War would go down. And all right, I know I say basically a lot, but I try to keep shit like basic because there's a lot, but here we go. Okay, so in early 1840, a band of Comanches had essentially captured a group of white settlers, and Colonel Henry Carnes wanted to meet with the Comanche in order to negotiate a peace settlement in return for the white settlers. So on March 19th, 1840, the Comanches would meet with them, and they would bring a few of the prisoners with them, including a 16-year-old girl who was said to have signs of torture and mutilation. And yeah, the soldiers were pissed at this, so they entered in the council house where the meeting was taking place and tried to arrest the Comanches, and a fight would break out. 7 soldiers, 35 Comanches, including 12 chiefs, would be killed, and 30 Comanche women and children would be taken prisoner. Now, the rest of the Comanche nation had believed that this was like a deliberate lure into a trap, so around 700 warriors would attack a small port called Linville, and they would kill some of the civilians that had not fled and slaughter the livestock and burn down the town. And a while after that happened, Texan forces would eventually intercept them and ultimately defeat that Comanche army that was there. Now, 2 months after that Comanche army was defeated, Colonel John Moore would lead a force into Comanche territory and attack a village on the Red Fork, and they would kill around 200 people and take 50 prisoners. And that would be the end of the Comanche War. 2 years later, we'd get the slave revolt in the Cherokee Nation, and this was dated as one of the largest escapes of a group of slaves to ever occur in the Cherokee Nation in what was known as Native American territory. And it would start around November 15th, 1842, when a group of around 20 African American slaves owned by the Cherokee would escape and try to reach Mexico, where slavery was abolished. Along their way, they were joined by around 20 other slaves escaping from the Creek Nation, and they would even meet 2 slave catchers who had a family of 8 slaves, and they would kill the slave catchers and free the family. A Native American party would eventually capture and kill most of these slaves, and 5 slaves were later executed for killing the slave catchers. Now, that same year, in 1842, the Second Seminal War would end. Okay, so basically one of the colonels that was in charge there declared that the remaining Seminoles would be left in peace if they would stay in the southern region of Florida, and Colonel Worth would eventually get authorization from the United States that he could leave the Seminoles there on an informal reservation of southwestern Florida. However, there were still bands of Native Americans that were not living in the reservation still. In August 1842, Congress had passed the Armed Occupation Act, which basically gave free land to any colonist, or I guess white settlers, who wanted to live on the land, but they had to be prepared to defend themselves from Native Americans. It was like, yeah, you can have this land, but you have to know that it technically doesn't belong to you. So if you want to stay on it, you're going to have to fight for it. Now, 4 years later, in 1846, the Mexican War would begin, and this would follow the 1845 U.S. annexation of Texas, in which Texas would become a part of the United States. And as you can imagine, this pissed off Mexico because Texas had originally belonged to them. So afterwards, Mexico started preparing for war because, they wanted their land back. And one of the first events of this war would be when a cavalry of around 2,000 forces from Mexico would attack a 70-man U.S. patrol, in which they killed 11 American soldiers and captured 52. And the war would officially begin. Now, that same year in 1846, I wouldn't really necessarily call it a war, more like a genocide, and it's stated officially that this ended in 1873, but I'm not going to point it out later in the video. The California Genocide was the killing of thousands of indigenous peoples living in California by the United States government agents and citizens in the 19th century, and it all really started following the California Gold Rush, which led to an influx of tons of people. And it's estimated that around 16,000 of California natives were killed by the end of this. 27,000 people were taken as slaves by settlers. Yeah. Now, the next year in 1847, the Cayuse War would begin. And I'm gonna have to give you all a little backstory on this one. So in 1836, two missionaries, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, founded the Whitman Mission among the Cayuse Native Americans, which was in present-day Washington. As you can imagine, your average mission was they established schools and even included their own religious teachings to the people. Now, in 1842, Marcus Whitman, he would travel and convince the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions to provide more support for them, like money and whatnot. And he would return the following year, except when he came back, there were thousands of settlers that were traveling to Oregon. But yeah, he came back and there were just a lot of American settlers that were traveling throughout that territory. And the Cayuse actually expected payment from wagon trains and settlers that were crossing through their territory and eating the food that the tribes were depending on, and even plowing the land, which they saw as desecrating to the spirit of the earth. And there would be different instances in which the Cayuse would try to collect payment from settlers, and they were sent away because they were seen as beggars. And of course, diseases would also be brought, which led to an epidemic of measles that killed half the Cayuse in 1847. And the Cayuse began to suspect that Marcus Whitman was responsible for the deaths of everyone, and he caused the disaster, this influx of immigrants that brought all these bad things upon them. So they attacked the mission on November 30th, 1847, and 14 settlers were killed, including both of the Whitmans, and most of the buildings were destroyed. And this event would be known as the Whitman Massacre, which led into the beginning of the Cayuse War. Now, that same year in 1847, we'd get the Taos Revolt, which was basically a small uprising against the United States occupation of present-day New Mexico. The leaders of this revolt, Pablo Montoya and Tomas Romero, would begin the revolt in present-day Taos, New Mexico, and Romero would lead a Native American force into the house of the governor, Charles Bent, where they shot him with arrows and scalped him in front of his family. And eventually, a force of around 500 would lay siege to a mill in Arroyo Hondo. Bruh, I probably said that so wrong, bruh. Arroyo Hondo. One of the men that was working at the mill saw the men coming, and he would actually ride to Santa Fe, where he would alert the U.S. of what was going on. They would eventually beat back a force of around 1,500 Hispanos at Santa Cruz, in which they would then retreat to Taos Pueblo, where they holed up in this large church. Eventually, the U.S. would breach a wall of the church and would shoot cannons into the interior, which killed around 150 of the rebels and captured around 400 after the battle. 28 men were executed, and this was actually one of the first executions by hanging in the Taos Valley. The next year, in 1848, the Mexican War would end. By this point, the U.S. forces had completely occupied the regional capital of Santa Fe. They also moved against the province of Alta California. They were blockading the Pacific coast. It was raps. It was raps by this point. And eventually, peace would be negotiated, which involved the United States agreeing to pay $15 million for physical damage, and Mexico had to pay $3 million. And they would also have to acknowledge the independence of Texas, which also meant, it belonged to the United States at that point. And yeah, that would be the end of that. The next year, in 1849, the Hickory War would begin. And this would all start when a group of white settlers would be approached by a band of Hickory, Apache, and Utes who would ask them for presents, and the settlers would say no, but then they would return to ask again, and they would say no, and the second time, the Utes and Hickory would actually attack them and kill everybody except for a woman named Ann White, her child, and her servant. Word would eventually reach the United States Army garrison near Taos, and from there, a small force was dispatched to rescue the prisoners that were taken. Eventually, they would catch up to the Hickoryas and Utes. They managed to defeat the force, but while chasing the rest of the Native Americans for about 200 yards, they would find the body of Ann White, who had been shot through the heart with an arrow, and her daughter and servant were never seen again. The next year, in 1850, we'd get the Bloody Island Massacre. Basically, Pomo Native Americans living in the Big Valley area had been enslaved and severely abused by settlers named Andrew Kelsey and Charles Stone, and they had essentially captured and enslaved these local Pomo people and forced them to build a permanent shelter with promises for rations that they didn't keep their promises. These people were starving. Yeah, these two guys, not even gonna lie, they were pretty shitty people. One of the young Pomo men would ask for food for his sick mother, and then he would be killed. Multiple people would starve to death. They would regularly sexually abuse the girls, and anyone that refused would be whipped. Yeah, it was bad. So what ended up happening was two Pomo men, Sook and Zexus, had been ordered to kill a cow, so they borrowed these horses to ride out and kill this cow. Apparently there was bad weather, and one of the horses ran off. They knew they'd be punished pretty badly. They probably would have been killed. So other people, knowing what happened, would pour water on the gunpowder, making it useless, and they would eventually attack the house at dawn and killed Kelsey and Stone. Eventually word would reach the United States military, and a regiment of dragoons would attempt to locate this band of Pomo people, and they instead came up on a village of Pomo and they just killed the people there. It was estimated that they killed 60 of the 400 Pomo that were living there, and there were even some accounts that said they killed 200. The next year, in 1851, the Chiricahua War would begin, and the first incident would occur near the Pinos Altos mining camp, in which Mangas Coloradas, an Apache tribal chief, and a member of the Membreno Apache would be attacked by a group of miners, and they would tie him to a tree and just beat him. The situation with Mangas Coloradas would be the starting point of this war. Bro, I just realized I had my fan on when I was recording like the last 5 minutes, so sorry about that. But anyways, 3 years later, in 1854, Bleeding Kansas would begin, and I'm gonna keep this one like as short as possible, because this was basically, think of it as like a mini civil war between pro-slavery and free staters. There would be electoral fraud, murder, assault. It was bad. But yeah, a lot happened. Like it would take way too long to actually like break that shit down, but I try to keep it as simple as possible. The next year, in 1855, the Puget Sound War would begin, and basically this all started with a proposed treaty by Washington Territory Governor Isaac Stevens, and the treaty basically preserved the Native Americans' fishing rights, but it also took away their farming land. And one of the Nisqually chiefs, Chief Leshy, was outraged about this. And on October 28th, 1855, several settlers would be attacked, and there would be 3 families that would be killed, and 3 children would be taken hostage. Eventually 2 of the children would be returned, and the 3rd one would actually be cared for by a Native American named Spoonbill. But in response to this attack, Americans would capture around 4,000 Native Americans and hold them at Fox Island, and many of these people would starve and die. That same year, in 1855, the Rogue River Wars would also begin, and this also started out in Washington with good old Governor Stevens, and basically he wanted to displace the Native Americans and take their land, but the army there didn't want to. They were opposed to that. However, the settlers, yeah, they wanted the land, so the settlers began actually attacking Native American villages, and the army would actually try to take some of these Native Americans into the fort to protect them, and still these mobs of settlers would raid villages and kill people. And it got to the point where the captain there, Captain Smith, tried to arrange the surrender of the Native Americans to the U.S. Army. But the Native Americans didn't want to do this, and they attacked the soldiers and then retreated. But eventually, a month later, they would surrender and were sent to reservations. However, there'd still be multiple skirmishes throughout the year. The same year, in 1855, the Third Seminal War would begin, and this would of course start due to increasing numbers of settlers that would come through southwest Florida and increasing tensions with them and the Seminoles living in the area. That December in 1855, U.S. Army personnel would actually destroy a large Seminole plantation, and apparently they were trying to deliberately provoke a violent response that would result in complete removal of the remaining Seminole citizens. And of course, they would get this response. A Seminole leader by the name of Halata Miko would respond by raiding small areas near Fort Myers, and the Third Seminal War would officially begin. In 1855, the Hickory War would also end. Now at this point, the U.S. Army was still looking for a band of Utes. They would eventually find the original group of the Hickoryas. A force would be led against them and they would be defeated, and the rest would disperse at that point, and many of them would just starve or die in the extreme cold. Same year, the Cayuse War would end. By this time, a force of over 500 would be led against the Cayuse, and eventually they would surrender and hand over 5 members that were responsible for the murder of the Whitmans, and they would be hung, and officially the war would be called as over in 1855. The next year, in 1856, the Rogue River War would end, and by this point, most of the Rogue River Native Americans were removed to northern reservations, and most of them would end up at the Grande Ronde Reservation in Oregon. But yeah, the war would end. That same year, 1856, the Puget Sound War would end. Leshy and his remaining warriors would be defeated and retreat to the Cascades in eastern Washington, and Chief Leshy would eventually be captured on November 1856, and he would be found guilty of murder and hanged on February 19th, 1858, 2 years later. Now, the same year, in 1856, we get the Second Opium War. Now, this was originally between the British Empire and French Empire against the Qing dynasty. And the way the United States got involved was they would send envoys to Hong Kong to offer military help to the British and French. And eventually, a Chinese garrison would shell a United States Navy steamer. I'm not sure if they did this on purpose or not, or if they even knew it belonged to the United States. But the U.S. Navy would retaliate by attacking river forts and taking control of them. And eventually, diplomatic efforts came into play, and the American and Chinese governments would sign an agreement for U.S. neutrality in the Second Opium War. And that would be the end of that. The next year, in 1857, we'd get the Utah War. And this all basically started when President James Buchanan decided to send U.S. forces to Utah Territory in what would be known as the Utah Expedition. And the people living there, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or also known as Mormons, were afraid that the U.S. military was sent there to annihilate them. And they had this fear because of facing persecution in other areas. So they started preparing a defense. Now, apparently they wanted to avoid as much bloodshed as possible. So some of the strategies were keeping them from sleeping, lighting fires, making animals stampede at them, just distractions for them, blocking the roads off with trees, all that type of stuff. And on September 11th, 1857, 120 settlers that were going to California from Arkansas, Missouri, and other states were killed by a group of Mormon militia, and they lied about it and said that they were killed by Native Americans, but it was proven otherwise. And eventually, in the end, the United States negotiated with the Latter-day Saints, and this resulted in a full pardon for the Latter-day Saints, except for those who were involved in the massacre. And the U.S. Army was granted peaceful entrance into Utah. A year later, in 1858, the Third Seminal War would end, and by this time, most of the remaining Seminoles were tired and facing starvation, and eventually surrendered to be removed to Indian Territory in exchange for promises of safe passage and cash payments. However, it was estimated that about 200 to 500 Seminoles still refused to leave and would live in the deep Everglades and Big Cypress Swamp, and apparently weren't bothered by American settlers as the land did not seem suitable to live in. That same year, in 1858, the Navajo Wars would begin. Alright, so this all started with a huge, severe drought that hit the Navajo and completely decimated their livestock and their agricultural resources, and this had caused a famine in the winter of 1857 to 1858, and while being weakened, they would be attacked by the surrounding tribes, which would lead to the Navajo demanding that Fort Defiance, which was a garrison of U.S. soldiers, to stop grazing on their livestock on prime Navajo land. And this would lead to soldiers shooting 48 cattle and 8 horses that belonged to Manuelito, who was a prominent Navajo leader, and that would then lead to Navajo warriors killing a servant of the commanding officer in retaliation for this. And then the United States would demand that the murderer be brought to them or that they would begin a war. The Navajo didn't want to give up their own people, so the Miles campaign was sent against them, leaving Fort Defiance on September 9th, 1858. Alright, the next year, in 1859, you get the Pig War. Alright, bro, let me tell you, bro. Shit did not happen, bro. Just listen to this. Alright, so basically, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler had moved to San Juan Island and one day found a pig in his garden, and it was eating his plants, so he shot it. And it turned out that the pig was owned by an Irishman named Charles Griffin, who was employed by the Hudson's Bay Company to run the sheep ranch on the island, and he also owned pigs that he would allow to roam freely. Now, Cutler was like, all right, that's my bad. I'll give you $10. I'll give you $10 for it. And that's like $200 today. But Griffin was like, nah. I want $100, which is like $3,000, bro. And then Cutler was like, you know what? That pig was on my land, bro. He was trespassing. I'm not paying you shit. And then Griffin was mad, and he was like, you know what? Bet you don't want to pay up. So he called the cops, man. He went to the British authorities, and they threatened to arrest Cutler. And then American settlers heard about this. Nah. Y'all not about to do shit to this American man. And basically, there was a standoff between thousands of soldiers, and nothing happened. That same year in 1859, we'd get John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And this was, in short, an effort by abolitionist John Brown to initiate a slave revolt in the southern states by taking over the United States Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. John Brown, who was accompanied by 22 other men, was defeated by U.S. Marines. 10 people would be killed, 5 would escape, and 7 would be tried and executed, including John Brown. And yeah, in 1859, we'd also get the First Cortina War, and this would basically start when Juan Cortina would shoot the town marshal in Brownsville for brutalizing Cortina's former employee. Tensions would increase between Cortina and the authorities at Brownsville, and Cortina would eventually raid and occupy the town with a posse of around 40 to 80 men. And Cortina would issue a proclamation basically saying his objective was to quote-unquote chastise the villainy of his enemies, which had gone unpunished. They had connived with each other to persecute and rob us without any cause and for no other crime on our part than that of being of Mexican origin. Cortina would keep control over Brownsville until September 30th, when he would evacuate the town. In those following days, the townsfolk that remained in Brownsville would form a 20-man group to fight Cortina called the Brownsville Tigers. The Brownsville Tigers would eventually be joined up by 2 large groups of Texas Rangers, which would lead Cortina to retreat up to the Rio Grande. And eventually there would be a battle at Rio Grande, and Cortina would be defeated, losing 60 men and all their equipment, and Cortina would retreat with his remaining men into the Burgos Mountains, and the war would be considered over by then. Now in 1860, we'd also get the Paeute War, and this took place with the Paeute tribe of Pyramid Lake in Utah Territory, which is now Nevada. The first occurrence of fighting would be a massacre of American workers at a way station, and this was done because they had supposedly kidnapped and raped a Paeute girl. So after this, a militia force was rounded up and led to Pyramid Lake, and then it was then ambushed and completely destroyed. Soon after that happened, U.S. troops would take the same route, and there would be a couple of small skirmishes, although there would never be any outright victory, and a truce between both sides would be signed. The next year, in 1861, bleeding Kansas would come to an end. The conflict would pretty much just roll into the Civil War. The Confederate States would secede from the United States, and Kansas would be admitted to the Union as a free state. Now that same year, 1861, the Civil War would begin, and let's be honest, if you're American, man, you've learned about this shit like 1,000 times. Here's a quick rundown. Politics up until this time were mainly focused on slavery. It was kind of like a competition between the free states in the North and the slave states in the South, and up until that point there was a constant fight for political power. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln would be elected president, and fearing that Abraham would take the slaves away, southern states began seceding from the USA and formed themselves into the Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln would refuse to recognize them as a sovereign nation, and in April 1861, the Confederates would attack Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and that would begin the war. That same year, we'd get the Second Cortina War in 1861, and this started literally in May 1861, like right after the American Civil War began. And Cortina would align himself with the federal government of the United States and would actually invade Zapata County, Texas, and would be defeated by the Confederate leader there, which would lead Cortina to retreat to Mexico. That would pretty much be the end of the Second Cortina War, although there would be several cases in which people accused him of promoting guerrilla actions against the Texan landowners during the Civil War. The next year, in 1862, we get the Dakota War. Alright, here's a little backstory. Up until this point, the Eastern Dakota had ceded large amounts of land to the United States in treaties that they signed in 1837, 1851, and 1858, and it was obvious that they got finessed. There was intentionally poor translation and miscommunication. The quote-unquote Indian agents that the U.S. had were giving these Native Americans bad advice. They got screwed over. The Dakota were promised payments, and the United States started being late on the payments, bro. They were grimy, bro. This led to traders refusing to extend credit to the tribesmen for food, and all of this was happening in 1861 to them while they were going through a harsh winter and crop failure. I will cut the U.S. some slack, alright? Just a little bit of fucking slack, because they were dealing with a civil war, so shit was going down. On August 17th, 1862, 4 Native American men would kill 5 white settlers in Minnesota, and that same night, a faction of Little Crow, who was a Dakota chief, decided to attack the Lower Sioux Agency the next morning in an effort to drive out all the settlers from the Minnesota River Valley. And in the weeks that followed, Dakota warriors would attack and kill hundreds of settlers and cause thousands of people to flee the area. About a month later, on September 23rd, 1862, an army of volunteer infantry and militia assembled by Governor Alexander Ramsey would finally defeat Little Crow at the Battle of Wood Lake. After their defeat, 2,000 Dakota would surrender or were taken into custody. Meanwhile, Little Crow and a group of around 300 followers would flee to the northern plains of Dakota Territory in Canada. The United States would then abolish the Eastern Dakota and Ho-Chunk reservations in Minnesota and declared their treaties null and void. And in May 1863, the 2,000 Eastern Dakota and Ho-Chunk that were forcibly imprisoned were exiled from Minnesota and sent to a reservation in South Dakota. Now the next year, in 1863, the Chiricahua War would end. And do y'all remember, I can't remember the last time I mentioned it, it was probably a little while ago, but it was Mangus Coloradus, the man who was tied to a tree and jumped. You remember that one? In 1861, after the American Civil War began, Mangus Coloradus and
Cochise,
his son-in-law, would strike an alliance and agreed to drive all Americans and Mexicans out of Apache territory. And they would lead campaigns against the Confederates. The United States military would eventually decide to move against the Arizona Confederates by sending a group of Californian volunteers there, and they would encounter Mangus Coloradus and
Cochise
his followers in 1862 And during this battle, soldiers would shoot and wound Mangus Coloradus. And after this, he would meet with a representative to call for peace with the United States. In January 1863, Coloradus would agree to meet with the U.S. military leaders at Fort McLean, and Coloradus would arrive under a white flag of truce to discuss peace. I guess the Americans weren't fucking with it, so they violated the neutrality of his white flag, took him into custody, and that night he was tortured and shot. And the following day, his head would be cut off and boiled and sent to the Smithsonian Institution. Same year in 1863, we'd get the New York draft riots. Basically, it is what it sounds like. It was one of the largest riots in American history. Initially, it was intended to express anger at the draft, and the protests would eventually turn into a race riot with white rioters attacking black people throughout the city. The official death toll was listed at around 120 people, and the military didn't even reach the city until the second day of rioting, which by the time they got there, most of the buildings had been destroyed, the churches were burned down, homes, a colored orphan asylum, and this would lead many of the African American residents to leave Manhattan permanently, with many moving to Brooklyn. The next year in 1864, the Navajo Wars would end, and at this point, the Navajo, of course, were going through famine. They were running out of food to begin with, and were continuously chased by the U.S. Army. So this led to groups of Navajo beginning to surrender. Eventually, many of the larger bands would surrender, and finally, in 1866, Manuelito would surrender, and all the Navajo would be forced to make what was called the Long Walk to a reservation at Fort Sumter, New Mexico. And yeah, it was pretty shitty, bro. It was like a 500-mile walk. Yeah. The same year, in 1864, we'd get the Colorado War. And at this point in time, the U.S. Army was planning to withdraw many of its units from the Great Plains to fight the Confederacy in the Civil War. However, Colonel John Chivington, commander of the Colorado Volunteers, reported that Native Americans had stolen 175 cattle from white people. And the Cheyenne would later state that they had found the cattle wandering freely in the plains and took them to their camps. Lieutenant George Ear would then gather a group of soldiers and leave to recover the cattle, and they would encounter a band of Cheyenne in which a fight would ensue and a soldier would be killed, and this would lead to the lieutenant burning 70 teepees of a nearby encampment and returning back to base with 20 cattle. Around the same time, a group of dog soldiers would encounter a group of around 20 U.S. soldiers, and the U.S. soldiers would demand that the dog soldiers throw down their weapons, and said that they suspected the dog soldiers of stealing 4 mules from a white owner. A fight would then ensue, and 2 United States soldiers were killed and 3 dog soldiers would be wounded. A mixed-blood Cheyenne warrior named George Bent would later state that many of the people in the area were puzzled to why these United States soldiers were causing unprovoked attacks, and it was speculated that altercations between the Native Americans and soldiers was an effort by Colonel Chivington and the Colorado Volunteers to avoid being sent to Kansas to fight the Confederates. Basically, yeah, bullshit like that would just keep happening, and eventually on November 29th, 1864, around 600 men belonging to the Colorado Volunteers, led by Colonel Chivington, would cross into Cheyenne and Arapaho territory and attack the village of Black Kettle, which flew both an American flag and a white flag of truce, and killed about 150 Native Americans, mostly unarmed women and children and elderly, because there were no warriors at the village during the attack. After the massacre, the Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho, Brule, and Oglala subtribes of the Lakota would meet around January 1st, 1865, and would agree on war with the whites. They then would attack Julesburg, which was a nearby settlement in Colorado. They killed 14 soldiers and 4 armed civilians, and the survivors would hide away while the settlement would be plundered. Eventually, on February 2nd, 1865, the Native Americans would leave their large camp and continue north towards the country of Wyoming to join their relatives there. And by December 1865, the war would just fizzle out, and a treaty would be signed by Chief Black Kettle agreeing to move his band of Southern Cheyenne to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. Now, next year, I guess that same year or whatever, 1865, the Civil War would end, and yeah, bro, it was raps. It was raps. By this time, the North had won the Battle of Gettysburg, and there was a naval blockade on the Confederate States. Union forces would maneuver their way to Georgia, and they would eventually split into two. Half would pursue the Southern troops, and the other half would head eastward towards Atlanta. And I think most of y'all noticed they burnt the land. They destroyed the farms, the railroads. They were wrapping it up by this point. The Confederate States would keep retreating, and they would be forced to retreat to Virginia countryside, and the remaining Southerners would be completely surrounded, and they would surrender in April 1865. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln would be shot and killed. A year later, in 1866, we'd get Red Cloud's War, and basically the United States had built forts in north central Wyoming in response to Native American attacks on civilian travelers. Now, there were 3 forts that were located there at the time. This war would basically just consist of small Native American raids and attacks on the soldiers and civilians there at the 3 forts. And the largest event of this war would be the Fetterman fight, in which the United States would lose 81 soldiers and was the worst military defeat suffered by the U.S. on the Great Plains until the Battle of Little Bighorn 10 years later. Eventually, peace would be achieved under the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, and the Lakota would be victorious. They would regain control of the western Powder River country, or this north central Wyoming territory, and they would take down the forts and permanently close a trail that had been set up for miners and other settlers. So yeah, they closed the trail down and would take the land back. 2 years after that ended, in 1870, we'd get the Maria's Massacre. Alright, so what basically all started this was a man named Malcolm Clark would be killed by a young pagan warrior named Owl Child. And 2 years prior to this, Owl Child had actually stolen horses from Clark as payback for the loss of his own horses, which he had blamed on Clark. And this would lead to Clark's son beating and humiliating Owl Child in front of a group of Blackfeet. And there were also claims from the Blackfeet that Clark had also raped Owl Child's wife. The warriors would first shoot and wound Clark's son, and then they would go into the house and shoot Clark in the chest before he would be killed with an axe. Now, people were pissed after this. The white settlers there demanded that the government protect them and suppress the outlawed Blackfeet, and in response, the U.S. Army would demand that the Blackfoot Confederacy execute Owl Child and deliver his body to them within 2 weeks. Owl Child would then flee north and join Mountain Chief's pagan band. When the 2-week deadline passed, General Philip Sheridan would send a squadron of cavalry to track down and punish the offending party. While this United States cavalry would travel through Native American territory, they had these scouts, right? And these scouts were supposed to be able to tell if a certain group of Native Americans was friendly from others, because to most Americans at the time, they were just like, all Indians are the same type shit. Eventually, this United States military group would come across a camp along the Marias River, and the scout Joe Kipp recognized that the camp belonged to Chief Heavy Runner, who was considered peaceful and not to be attacked per their orders. And when the scout told Major Eugene Baker, the leader of the company, Baker said, "That makes no difference, one band or another, they're all Blackfeet, and we will attack them." Baker then ordered a sergeant to shoot the scout if he tried to warn the sleeping camp of Blackfeet, and then gave the command to attack. The scout would shout and try to prevent the attack, and he would get arrested for that shit. And the noise would alert the Blackfeet camp and Chief Heavy Runner. Heavy Runner would then run towards the soldiers, shouting and waving a piece of paper that granted them safe conduct from the Indian Bureau, and he would be shot and killed. And yeah, it would just, I don't know what to tell you, bro. They would just be a massacre. They'd shoot into the lodges where the people were sleeping. About 200 people were killed, and then they burned the bodies. A year later, in 1871, the Yavapai War would begin. And basically, what started this was the Camp Grant Massacre, in which nearly 200 Pinal and Arikara Apaches were massacred by Udham warriors, Mexican settlers, and American settlers, and the survivors would then flee north into the Tonto Basin to seek protection from their Yavapai and Tonto allies. From that point, there would be a series of United States Army campaigns sent in their direction to return the natives to the reservation system. And yeah, that would begin in 1871. The next year, in 1872, we get the Modoc War, and how this started was there was a murder of settlers in a raid by the Pitt River tribe, and an American militia unit would retaliate, but they weren't familiar with the Native American tribes, so they just attacked the first village they saw, which was an innocent Modoc village, and killed the men, women, and children there. So the Modoc, they were pissed after this, and they chose to attack the next white settlers that they encountered. And they would eventually attack a wagon train of around 65 men, women, and children on their way to California. Hostilities would continue, and there would be a couple skirmishes until a treaty would be signed in which the Native Americans ceded millions of acres of land to the U.S., and the Klamath Reservation was established in present-day Oregon. Under these treaty terms, the Modoc gave up their lands and moved to the reservation. However, when these Modoc were building their homes on the reservations, the Klamath, who were their rivals, would steal their lumber and just continue to harass the Modoc. Now the Modoc would continue to try and find a suitable location to live within the reservation, but they would keep being harassed. And eventually the commanding officer at Fort Klamath was given orders to move the Modoc to a different reservation, and the Modoc would agree to go to the reservation with them. However, things would become tense when the captain of the soldiers, Captain James Jackson, would order the chief, Captain Jack, to surrender his weapons. And the chief was alarmed at this command. He didn't understand why he had to surrender their weapons, but he finally agreed to put them down, and the rest of the Modoc warriors began to follow his lead. It's not exactly sure who started this argument, but an argument would erupt between a Modoc warrior and one of the soldiers, and they would both draw their revolvers and shoot at each other, which would cause the rest of the Modocs to start going for their weapons that they left on the ground. There would be a small fight, and the Modoc would eventually retreat, and this would result in one soldier being killed, 7 wounded, and the Modoc would lose 2 people with 3 wounded. Eventually, in April 1873, during a peace commission meeting, Captain Jack and others would kill General Edward Canby, and they believed that by doing this would encourage the Americans to leave, but they were wrong. U.S. forces would come with more reinforcements, and the Modoc would eventually surrender. Captain Jack and 3 other warriors would be executed, and the remaining 150 Modoc would be sent to Indian Territory. A year after the end of the Modoc War, in 1874, we'd get the Battle of Liberty Place, and this was basically an attempted insurrection by the Crescent City White League, or I guess you could equate them to the KKK. 5,000 members of the White League would fight against the New Orleans Metropolitan Police and state militia. They would hold the State House, Armory, and downtown for 3 days and would retreat before the arrival of the federal troops. This was basically related to political tensions between white people and black people. But yeah, they were Democrats at the time and were very upset about the appointing of Republican officials. That same year, in 1874, we get the Election Massacre, 2 months after the Battle of Liberty Place in Alabama. So this was in the South, all right? And at this point, freedmen or ex-slaves comprised the majority of the population and had been electing Republican candidates to office, and this pissed off the White League that was there. So in Eufaula, Alabama, members of the White League would kill an estimated 50 black voters and wound 20 while driving away more than 1,000 unarmed black people at the polls. They would then hijack the elections and turn all the Republicans out of office, and Democratic candidates would take up a majority of offices up for election. The next year, in 1875, the Avapai War would end, and what would happen to end this would be a group of United States military scouts would find a cave near Salt River Canyon that was being used as a hideout by Quaquipaya and Yavapai people. And the cave would be sieged by around 120 United States soldiers. They would be ordered to fire at the roof of the cave which would cause fragments and lead and shrapnel to rain down on the people. They would then be trapped around the mouth of the cave, and soldiers would then push boulders on them and kill them. Now, the rest of the surviving Yavapai would be so demoralized by this that they would surrender on April 6th, 1873, and the war would be officially considered over in 1875. The next year, in 1876, we'd get the Great Sioux War, and basically what really threw a lot of fuel on the fire for this one was in the previous year, in May 1875, Sioux delegations headed by Chief Spotted Tail, Red Cloud, and Lone Horn would travel to Washington, D.C. to try and persuade President Ulysses S. Grant to honor the existing treaties between them and kind of like stem the flow of miners into their territories. They would meet with Grant and a commissioner of Indian Affairs that some just bullshit. And the U.S. leaders would say that Congress wanted to pay the tribes $25,000 for the land and just have them relocate to Indian territory. The Native Americans would refuse this and would leave without finding a solution, and as you can imagine, tensions would be very high after this. The United States also wanted to attempt to secure the Black Hills, which they proposed that the route of the Northern Pacific Railroad would cross through, but the Native Americans did not want to give up this land since it was the last of the Great Buffalo hunting grounds. The United States would eventually instruct the Lakota and Sioux to leave and return to reservations by January 31st of 1876, and the deadline would come to that date and they wouldn't leave. So winter campaigns would be sent against the quote-unquote hostiles, and the Great Sioux War would begin. Now, I'm not going to go over every single battle, but just know by the point of May 1877, about a year, the resistance against the United States would begin to collapse, and Chief Crazy Horse and other allied leaders would arrive with their people at the Red Cloud Agency in Nebraska to surrender. The U.S. Army would then arrest Crazy Horse, and quote-unquote, he would allegedly attempt to resist being arrested and be stabbed to death. And Chief Sitting Bull and his group would escape north across the border into Canada. They would eventually finally surrender in 1880, ceding the Black Hills to the U.S., which was ironic since the Black Hills was... like, bro, like, I'm not even joking. The Black Hills was off limits, like completely off limits to the U.S. due to this treaty called the Fort Laramie Treaty. But yeah, it was just a load of bullshit, man. After the Sioux War would end in 1877, we'd also get the Nes Paris War. And a little backstory, in 1855, at the Walla Walla Council, the Nes Paris was coerced by the federal government into giving up their ancestral lands and moving to the Umatilla Reservation in the Oregon Territory. This treaty granted the Nes Paris the right to remain in a large portion of their own lands in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon territories in exchange for relinquishing about 5 million acres of their 13 million acre homeland to the U.S. government. Under the terms of the treaty, no white settlers were allowed on the reservation without permission of the Nes Paris. However, in 1860, gold would be discovered near present-day Pierce, and 5,000 settlers would rush onto the reservation, illegally founding and building the city of Lewiston as a supply depot on Nes Pierce land. The U.S. government would fail to keep settlers out of Native American territory, and the Nes Paris were, of course, pissed off at this because the treaty was not being upheld. In 1869, a group of Nes Paris would be coerced into signing 90% of their reservation away to the U.S., leaving only 750,000 acres in Idaho territory. And under the new terms of that treaty, all Nes Paris were to move onto the new and much smaller reservation east of Lewiston. However, a large number of Nes Paris did not accept the validity of the treaty and refused to move to the reservation and chose to remain on their traditional lands. The Nes Paris would eventually be pursued by the U.S. Army, who during the duration of the war would fight small skirmishes and battles. And eventually the war would end after a final 5-day battle in which a large majority of the surviving Nes Paris would surrender to the United States military. Yeah, that would be the end of that. 2 years later, in 1879, we get the White River War, and basically what happens, members of a band of Ute Native Americans would attack the Indian agency on the reservation, killing the Indian agent Nathan Meeker and his 10 male employees, and taking 5 women and children as hostages. Nathaniel Meeker had been attempting to convert the Utes to Christianity and try to make them farmers and prevent them from following their nomadic culture. And on the same day of that massacre, United States Army forces that were en route to the agency due to past threats against Meekers would be attacked by Utes, and the major leading the soldiers, including 13 other troops, would be killed, and the Utes would disperse. Now, after this conflict, this would result in the Utes losing most of the land granted to them, and they were forcibly removed from their land, which opened up millions of acres of land for settlers. But the same year, in 1879, we'd get Victorio's War, and basically, the U.S. government were pursuing the policy of concentrating all Apache bands to the San Carlos Indian Reservation in the Arizona desert. And Victorio and the group of Warm Springs Apache did not want to move because some of the Apaches at the San Carlos Reservation were enemies of the Warm Springs band, and apparently the management of the reservation was corrupt. The reservation was characterized by overcrowding, little grass and livestock to graze, bad water and hot temperatures, as deaths of the Apaches at the reservations were pretty numerous, especially from malaria and disease. During this time, Victoria's Apaches ended up attacking settlers near Silver City in the beginning of April 1879, and from then on the U.S. military would be in constant pursuit of Victorio's band. Throughout the year, Victorio would lead a guerrilla war across southern New Mexico and West Texas and northern Mexico, and I'm sorry guys, but I'm not going to get in like every battle. That'd be kind of like too many. But he fought many battles and skirmishes with the United States Army and would raid several settlements until the Mexican Army would kill him and most of his warriors on October 1880. And that would be the end of Victorio's War. 7 years after Victorio's War would end, in 1887, we'd get the Crow War, and this was a very small incident in which a young medicine man wraps up his tail, or sword bearer would lead a small group of warriors in a raid against a group of Blackfoot, which had captured horses from a Crow reservation. After the raid, sword bearer led his group back to the Crow agency to inform the Indian agent of his victory, but an incident would arise in which a fight would break out between the Crow and United States soldiers, and this would cause sword bearer to take his followers into the mountains and flee, and in response the United States Army would launch a campaign to bring the Crow back to the reservation, and they would be successful. There wouldn't be that much bloodshed, and this would be considered the last Native American war fought in Montana. 3 years later, in 1890, we get the Pine Ridge Campaign, or Wounded Knee Massacre, and here's a backstory. In the years leading up to this conflict, the U.S. government had continued to seize Lakota lands, and bison herds were hunted to near extinction. Treaty promises were not being held up to keep white settlers out of Native American territory. Yeah, there was a lot of unrest throughout the reservations. And during this time, news would spread among the reservations of a Paeute prophet named Wovoka, who was the founder of the ghost dance religion. And according to Wovoka, he had a vision that the Christian Messiah, Jesus Christ, had returned to earth in the form of a Native American. According to Wovoka, the white invaders would disappear from the native lands, the buffalo herds and all other animals would return in abundance, and the ghosts of their ancestors would return to earth, hence why the religion was called the ghost dance. It was said that afterwards they would then live in peace, and all of this would be represented by a performance of the slow and solemn ghost dance, which was kind of like performed as a shuffle in silence to a slow and single drum beat. Now this scared United States settlers, who were alarmed by the sight of different tribes performing this dance, and they were worried that it might prelude to an armed attack. So United States officials, specifically a United States Indian agent at the Standing Rock Agency, where Chief Sitting Bull was living, decided to attempt to take some of the chiefs into custody in order to quell what they called a Messiah craze. So an agent from the Standing Rock Agency would send appointed Native American police to arrest Sitting Bull. About 40 Native American policemen would arrive to Sitting Bull's house to arrest him, and Sitting Bull would refuse to comply, which resulted in the police using force on him, and this enraged the village. A Lakota would shoot one of the police, who reacted by firing his revolver into the chest of Sitting Bull. Another police officer would shoot Sitting Bull in the head, and Sitting Bull would die. And after his death, 200 members of his band would flee to Standing Rock to join Chief Spotted Elk at the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. The United States would then call on Chief Spotted Elk to make his way to the Pine Ridge Agency, and Spotted Elk and around 400 of his followers would begin making the trip there when they would be met by United States 7th Cavalry Detachment under Major Samuel M. Whitside. And the soldiers would then escort the group of Native Americans to Wounded Knee Creek, where they told them to make camp. Later that night, the U.S. soldiers would be reinforced, bringing their numbers up to around 500 troops, and they would begin to surround the encampment and would set up 4 rapid-fire M1875 mountain guns. The next morning, on December 29th, 1890, Colonel James W. Forsyth would order the surrender of the weapons and immediate removal of the Lakota to trains that were apparently awaiting for them. The soldiers would begin confiscating rifles, and a medicine man by the name of Yellowbird would begin performing the ghost dance. A man by the name of Black Coyote would refuse to give up his rifle, with the reasonings being that he did not speak English and was deaf and did not understand the order. The Lakota would say, "Stop, he can't hear your orders," and at that moment, the soldiers would seize Black Coyote from behind, and this would cause his rifle to be discharged. At the same moment, Yellowbird would throw dust into the air, and approximately 5 Lakota with concealed weapons would open fire on some of the troops. And after this exchange, everything just went to hell. The soldiers just started shooting everybody. Some of the Lakota started trying to grab their rifles, and there was no cover. The soldiers would use their machine guns to open fire on the teepees full of women, men, and children. And even some of the United States soldiers would be killed by friendly fire from their own machine guns. Some groups of Lakota would flee the camp during the fighting to avoid being caught in the crossfire, and soldiers would get on their horses and pursue them, in some cases for miles, and kill them. In less than an hour, more than 250 Lakota would be killed, and 20 United States soldiers would be awarded the Medal of Honor. The next year, in 1891, we'd get the Garza War, and this was led by Caterino Garza, who had issued a statement declaring that the citizens of Mexico were treated like, quote, despicable slaves, and that the Mexican government was plagued by frightful corruption. And Garza would call on Mexicans to rise en masse in the name of liberty and the Constitution and overthrow the Mexican government. Many of the Garzistas were Mexican Americans that were recruited in Texas, and the guerrilla warfare would become a huge factor in this war, as there weren't that many Garzistas. However, they were able to blend in very easily with the civilian population and never stayed in Mexican territory for more than a few days, as they used horses to ride back and forth across the border. Now, this war would take place over the course of 2 or 3 years, and even the American army would engage in small skirmishes within the vicinity of the Rio Grande Valley. Caterino Garza's forces would eventually just dwindle down. Many people would surrender to local authorities, and by March of 1893, the war was considered over. 3 years after the end of the Garza War, in 1896, we'd get the Yaqui Uprising, and I'm going to keep this as short as possible. Here we go. You listening? All right. There were some revolutionaries in Mexico because of anti-indigenous Mexican policies, and they would be fighting with the Mexican government. The United States wouldn't get involved until very later, and there was just one incident, asked for some help after an attack along the Arizona border. So the United States got some forces together, and it would just be a small fight. At least 3 people would die, and the rebels would end up retreating. And that would be the last of the United States involvement. 2 years later, in 1898, we get the Wilmington Insurrection. This was pretty much a coup that was organized by a group of white supremacists, and it was a result of Southern Democrats conspiring and leading a group of 2,000 white men to overthrow the elected biracial government in Wilmington. And they would go in and expel the opposing black and white political leaders from the city, destroy property and businesses. That's what happened. The man that led the coup, politician Alfred Moore Waddle, would then take mayorship in office and would hold it until 1905. The same year, in 1898, we'd also get the Spanish-American War, and this happened in Cuba, and what really led up to this was Cuban Independence. There were constant revolts that were in Cuba against Spanish colonial rule, and the United States wanted to, there were different sentiments among the people, but specifically President William McKinley, he didn't want to go to war with Spain. But a lot of people supported Cuban independence due to reports of concentration camps being set up to control the populace. And think about it, this was a country that had broken their European ties. They probably wanted to see the same for the Cubans. Like I mentioned, President McKinley did not want to go to war. However, a United States Navy armored cruiser would mysteriously explode and sink in the Havana harbor. And members of the Democratic Party were like, nah, f that. McKinley, we gotta go to war. So McKinley would sign a joint congressional resolution demanding Spanish withdrawal. In response, Spain would sever diplomatic relations with the United States, and Spain would sue for peace after 2 Spanish squadrons were sunk in the battles of Santiago de Cuba, and the war would end with the 1898 Treaty of Paris, negotiating in terms favorable to the U.S., and Spain would cede ownership of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands to the United States, and the United States was also granted temporary control of Cuba. And yeah, that would be the end of the Spanish-American War. The same year, in 1898, we get the Second Samoan Civil War. Here's the backstory on it. I'm going to do my best to not butcher these names. Okay, the king, Malitoa Lapepa, would die, and a man named Mataafa Losefo would return from exile and would be elected into power by a council of Samoan chiefs. And in response to this, the British Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy forces would land in support of Lapepa's son against Mataafa and his German allies. I'm not going to go over every single battle. There were quite a few battles, and it's not even like anyone would prevail throughout this war anyways, as the whole war would eventually end a year later in 1899, and it would be agreed to split the Samoan Islands into American Samoa and German Samoa, and that would be the end of that. Now, after that war would end in 1899, the Philippine American War would begin. Alright, so if you guys remember, after the Spanish-American War a few years prior and the Treaty of Paris, the United States would take possession of the Philippines from Spain, and the people, the Filipino nationalists, they wanted independence for their country. So yeah, things between the United States and the Filipino people were kind of tense to begin with. The war would begin on February 4th, 1899, when a private from a volunteer infantry regiment would open fire on a lieutenant and another Filipino soldier and kill them both. And there are mixed claims on whether they were armed or not, but this would then trigger a small battle called the Battle of Manila. And the following day, a Filipino General Isidoro Torres would meet with General Otis under a flag of truce, and he was trying to deliver the message that the fighting had begun on an accident. He was like, hey bro, I don't know what happened between them, but hey man, it was an accident. We cool, right? Your man's fired upon our man's and we got in a little battle, and I don't even know what the fuck happened, so we good, right? And General Otis was like, nah bro. Alright, I'm gonna quote him. He said, the fighting has begun and must go on to the grim end. So yeah, it was up at that point. For most of 1899, the beginning year of the war, it would just mostly be guerrilla fighting, as that would be the main strategy of the Filipinos against the United States. And there would be multiple ambushes, raids, and guerrilla victories. And President McKinley would even consider withdrawing when the fighting got really intense later that year. Same year, in 1899, the Moro Rebellion would begin. And basically, these Moro people were constantly resisting foreign rule. And despite even having claim over the Moro territories, Spain would cede their land to the United States in the Treaty of Paris after the Spanish-American War, and the Moro people still were resisting American rule as they had done with Spain. Eventually, the United States would meet up with the Moro Sultanate and sign the Curran-Bates Treaty, which guaranteed the Moro autonomy in its internal affairs and governance. It also guaranteed that they would be able to preserve slavery, which was their way of life at the time. However, once the Americans would gain a foothold in the northern Philippines and subdue the northern Filipinos, the Bates Treaty with the Moros would be nullified. and they would invade Moro land. Yeah, and then, the Moro Rebellion would begin. Now, the same year, in 1899, we'd get the Boxer Rebellion, and this was an anti-foreign, anti-colonial, anti-Christian uprising in China that began in 1899. And up until this point, villagers in North China feared the expansion of foreign influence, and northern China specifically began experiencing several natural disasters, including the Yellow River flooding and droughts. These people, the Boxers, blamed this on foreign and Christian influence. So the Boxers began spreading violence across the North China plain, destroying foreign property and attacking and murdering Christian missionaries and Chinese Christians. Eventually, an 8-nation alliance would form. As you see, there's a lot of countries involved. And the Empress of China would begin to support the Boxers and issue an imperial decree declaring war on the invading powers. This would basically just split China in half, with half supporting the Boxers and those supporting the foreign powers, which was mostly led by Prince Qing. The 8-nation alliance would bring 20,000 armed troops into China, defeat the imperial army in Tianjin, and arrive in Beijing on August 14th. And the Boxers were executed, like literally executed, and China would be paid in today's worth, all right? In today's worth, they would be paid $10 billion yearly over the course of the next 39 years by the 8 nations that were involved. Now, a couple years later, in 1902, the Philippine American War would end. I just want to take a minute and celebrate, because we made it, bro. We made it to the 1900s, bro. We're no longer in the fucking Stone Age. All right, so by this point, I want you guys to think of like the Vietnam War, the relation between these two wars, especially when it came to guerrilla fighting. The U.S. Army at times did not even know who their enemy was, or wasn't even able to see them. This war was fucked, bro. Like, it was so fucked. We'd put people in camps. It was bad. The leader of the Philippine Army would eventually be captured. However, another General Miguel Malvar would take over leadership and launch offensive attacks against American-held towns. But eventually, Malvar would surrender on April 16th, 1902. And the United States would then kind of form a government in the Philippines. We'd establish a Philippine Assembly with an upper house consisting of the Philippine Commission. And the United States Bill of Rights was also extended to Filipinos. But this war was pretty fucked. I'm not even gonna lie, bro. Like, there was a point in this war in which a General Jacob H. Smith, was so mad about the guerrilla massacre of U.S. troops that he ordered his soldiers to just attack the inhabitants and I quote, kill everyone over the age of 10. But shit like that was going on like across the Philippines. But of course, there were some decent people that did not obey the orders. However, it still happened. Anyways, all that would end in 1902. 7 years later, in 1909, we'd get Crazy Snake's War. Crazy Snake was a Creek Native American named Chito Harjo. And basically, by this time, these Creek people had formed their own government. They had their own Creek constitution by the time, and even had their own police. Now, Chito Harjo, or Crazy Snake, he would be elected principal chief of the Creek Nation. However, this Creek Nation didn't exist in the view of the American government, as, the legality of it was nil. It meant nothing. Now, in 1907, Jim Crow laws would be introduced, and a group of African Americans, also referred to as Creek freedmen, would begin to gather together, and they'd live together at Harjo's ceremonial grounds. And in March 1909, during an annual meeting of the Creek traditionalists, there was an allegation that one of them or their African American allies had stolen some meat from a local white farmer, and an American sheriff deputy would be sent to arrest someone. However, the African Americans would drive him away because they knew that neither an African American or a Muskogee Creek had a chance at a fair trial and was most likely just going to be lynched. The sheriff would then organize a posse to enforce an arrest, and And in the following battle, one African American man would be killed and 42 would be arrested. A second confrontation would happen later that month on March 27th, when a posse would be sent to arrest Chito Harjo, and they would open fire on the posse men, killing 2 of them before escaping in the darkness of the night. And eventually the state militia would form and occupy Chito Harjo's land to restore order. However, Harjo would never be captured, and it was ruled that he likely died in April of 1911. A year later, in 1910, the Mexican border war would begin, and fighting would basically break out when revolutionary activity would begin in Mexico. And that would lead the United States Army to just deploy to several border towns to protect American lives and property. Basically just make sure that the fighting remained between the Mexican revolutionaries and the Mexican federal forces. There would be a couple of attacks on border towns by Mexican revolutionaries, but none of the border towns would ever be captured, and there would also be some cases where rebels would cross the border and surrender to the United States Army. Eventually, Francisco Madero would become the president of Mexico, and he would call for an end to the war going on in the country, and he would even pay the rebels of different factions, but only if they laid down their arms and joined the new federal army. But yeah, there wasn't really much United States involvement in this war. 2 years later, in 1912, we'd get the Little Race War, and this was the armed uprising of the, quote, independence of color, which was a conflict between Afro-Cuban rebels and the armed forces of Cuba in the United States. And yeah, people were pissed about the racism that was going on, the colorism. The chief of the Cuban National Army would order inhumane warfare against the rebels and would just kill them. They killed like no less than 5,000 of them. And the U.S. military would apparently intervene at the end, be like, stop. And the leaders of the revolution would be killed, and that would be pretty much the end of that. The same year, in 1912, the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua would begin. All right, and basically, by this point, the Nicaraguan president, Jose Santos Zelaya of the Liberal Party, was facing opposition from the Conservative Party, which was led by Governor Juan Jose Estrada. And Estrada was receiving support from the U.S. government as a result of American entrepreneurs giving him money for the rebellion in hopes of gaining economic concessions if the rebellion prevailed. Now, the United States military barely had any presence in Nicaragua, with only one U.S. Navy ship off the coast of Bluefields, which was conveniently where Estrada was, and it was allegedly there to protect the interests of the American citizens. 2 Americans would be arrested and indicted for allegedly joining the rebellion and laying out mines. And President Zelaya would order the execution of the 2 Americans, and this, kind of pissed off the U.S. And eventually, U.S. Marine Corps Major Smedley Butler would arrive on the coast of Nicaragua with around 300 Marines for the purpose of providing security in the Bluefields. And this would all lead to Zelaya leaving the country and leaving a man named Jose Madriz in charge. Madriz then had to face an advance by Eastern rebel forces, and he was like, "F this, I'm resigning." And that would lead to Juan Estrada becoming the president of Nicaragua, with the official recognition coming from the United States. The United States would then begin formal occupation, and American military interventions in Nicaragua were designed to stop any other nation except the United States from building a Nicaraguan canal, because that was the whole plan. The next year, in 1913, the Moro Rebellion would end, and if you guys remember, this was the people that the United States had broken the treaty with after the Philippine Rebellion, and it was agreed that the Moro province needed to transition to a form of civil government. So they had a change in administration, and in December of 1913, the governor of the province would be replaced by a civilian named Frank Carpenter, and that would just pretty much, it'd be over. A year later, in 1914, we get the U.S. occupation of Veracruz, and basically what happened was, here we go. Victoriano Huerta was the president of Mexico, and Woodrow Wilson withdrew U.S. recognition from Huerta's government and began encouraging great powers to follow suit. And the situation would escalate when Woodrow Wilson would impose an arms embargo on Mexico in August 1913. And later on, rebellions in the states of Chihuahua, And Morelos, led by Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, would break out after Huerta declared victory in a blatantly fraud election. The U.S. would supply Pancho Villa with munitions in order to defeat Huerta, then eventually occupy the port of Veracruz because there was an alert that Huerta had an delivery of weapons that was shipping there for him. So Woodrow Wilson would issue an immediate order to seize the port's customs office and confiscate the weaponry, and the city would be secured. The revolutionaries would pretty much prevail at the end, and Huerta would resign. Now that same year, in 1914, we'd get the Bluff War, and this was one of the last armed conflicts between the United States and Ute and Paeute Native Americans in Utah. And basically, in March 1914, Tesei Nagat, who was the son of a Paeute chief, was accused of murdering a shepherd named Juan Chacon, and a posse would attempt to arrest Tesei Nagat in February 1915. The Paeute and Ute bands would ultimately resist, and several people on both sides were killed or wounded, and eventually Tesei Nagat would be surrendered to the U.S. Army, and on July 1915 he would be found innocent of murder. In 1915, the U.S. occupation of Haiti would begin. Leading up to this, Haiti was experiencing great political instability and was heavily in debt to France, Germany, and the United States. Political tensions in the country were often between two groups who were wealthy French-speaking mulatto Haitians who represented the minority of the population, and poor Afro-Haitians who spoke Haitian Creole, and various revolutionary armies would carry out coups. Between 1911 and 1915, Haiti would have 7 presidents because of political assassinations, coups, and forced exiles. Following the assassination of the Haitian president in July of 1915, President Woodrow Wilson would send the United States Marines to Haiti in order to restore order and maintain political and economic stability in the Caribbean. The next year, in 1916, the U.S. occupation of the Dominican Republic would begin. And basically, in May 1916, Rear Admiral William B. Caperton would force the Dominican Republic Secretary of War, Desiderio Arias, who had gotten there by seizing power from Juan Isidro Jimenez, to leave Santo Domingo by threatening the city with naval bombardment. And then the Marines would land 3 days later and establish effective control of the country within a couple months. About a year later, in 1917, we'd get World War I. And, alright, bro, okay. I'm not going to cover, like, this whole thing, but here's the rundown, alright? A teenage member of a Serbian nationalist movement would assassinate Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, and Austria-Hungary would demand immediate retaliation against Serbia. And although Germany did not want to get involved, their alliance with Austria-Hungary would force them to declare war as well, and France and Britain would also get sucked into this war. And the reason for American involvement, this telegraph that was intercepted or something that was sent by Germany to Mexico, and apparently it said, Mexico, attack the United States and help us. Yeah, and then it sent the United States to war. Now, a year later, in 1918, the Russian Civil War would begin. And in the prior year, the Russian monarchy had been overthrown by the 1917 February Revolution, and that would then culminate into the Bolshevik-led October Revolution, overthrowing the provisional government of the Russian Republic. Bolshevik rule would not be accepted throughout the country, and everything would descend into a civil war, with the largest combatants being the Red Army, who were fighting for the Bolshevik form of socialism, led by Vladimir Lenin, and loosely allied forces known as the White Army. In addition, there would be rival militant socialists, notably the left SRs, as well as non-ideological green armies that opposed the Reds, the Whites, and the foreign interventionists. 13 foreign nations would intervene against the Red Army, notably the former Allied military forces from World War I, with the goal of reestablishing the Eastern Front. And 3 other foreign nations of the Central Powers would also intervene, rivaling the Allied intervention. The next year, in 1919, the Mexican border war would end, and the height of the conflict would come when revolutionary Pancho Villa would attack the American border town of Columbus, New Mexico, and in response, the United States Army would launch an expedition into northern Mexico to find and capture Villa, and the revolutionary himself would escape, and the American army would eventually return to the United States. in 1917, and eventually the Mexican army and American army would join forces to fight the Villistas led by Pancho Villa, and that would be the second largest battle of the Mexican Revolution and was considered the last battle of the Border War. Alright, that same year in 1919, okay, so basically there was this group called the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America that had organized chapters in the Elaine area, and representatives would meet with around 100 black farmers at a church near Elaine to discuss how to obtain fair settlements from landowners. Around 100 African American farmers would meet there, and Union advocates would bring armed guards to protect the meeting, and 2 deputized white men and a black trustee would arrive at the church and shots would be exchanged, leading to a policeman being killed and another white man would be wounded, and it was never determined who shot first. The county sheriff would then organize a posse in order to put down what was rumored to be a black insurrection, and a mob of around 1,000 men would be formed, and they would attack black people on site across the county. Nearly 600 U.S. troops would arrive, finding the area in chaos, and fighting in the area would last 3 days before troops ended the violence, and the federal troops would disarm both parties and the rest 285 black residents. The white mobs were aided by federal troops and terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, and after the massacre, state officials concocted an elaborate cover-up claiming that the African Americans were planning an insurrection, and it was successful actually. National newspapers would repeat that the African Americans in Arkansas were staging an insurrection, and a New York Times headline would read, "Planned Massacre of the Whites Today." But yeah, more than 100 African Americans would be indicted, with 12 being sentenced to death by electrocution. And yeah, that was that. A year later, in 1920, we'd get the Hickory Massacre. And alright, basically, here we go. In the weeks leading up to the presidential election of 1920, African Americans throughout the South were registering to vote in record numbers, and at the same time the Ku Klux Klan was establishing a lot of chapters around the South. And 3 weeks before Election Day, the KKK warned the African American community that not a single Negro would be permitted to vote. And when Election Day would come around, Mose Norman and July Perry, both known as prosperous African American landowners in Hickory, would lead the local registration efforts in Orange County by paying the poll tax for people who couldn't afford it. Now this pissed off the racist people there, and African Americans were met with resistance from the white community when they tried to vote. Now, Mose Norman would contact Judge John Chaney, who told him that interference with voting was illegal, and to write down the names of the African Americans that were denied their constitutional rights, as well as the names of the white people who were violating them. Norman would then return to the polling place with a shotgun before it being taken from him, and then used to drive him out of the polling place. Later that evening, Sam Salisbury, the former chief of police of Orlando, was called to lead a lynch mob and find and punish Norman. So a mob was formed, and they would surround the home of July Perry, which was where Norman was. And yeah, they would try to break in, and around 3 white people would be killed trying to get in. The mob would then leave and then call for reinforcements. During this, July Perry, who was injured during the conflict and was trying to flee with the help of his wife, was found by the white mob and arrested. And after being treated at a hospital for his wounds, he would be taken by a mob from the vehicle he was being transferred to jail to, and they would lynch him and leave his body hanging from a telephone pole beside the highway. With the reinforcements, the white mob would turn the conflict on the rest of the African American community in northern Hickory and set people's houses on fire and just shoot African Americans and burn down the churches and schoolhouses. Eventually, they were all driven out, literally driven out of town. A year later, in 1921, we'd get the Battle of Blair Mountain. And basically, since the founding of the United Mine Workers Union in 1890, coal mines in Mingo County, West Virginia, and its surroundings only hired non-union workers and strictly enforced employment contracts that included union membership as grounds for immediate termination. And as most miners in the area exclusively lived in company towns, termination meant that they would be evicted from their homes. In 1920, the United Mine Workers' new president, John L. Lewis, sought to finally unionize the area and was under increased pressure to do so due to many people participating in the coal strike of 1919 and affected mine operators who were being undercut by non-union mines in West Virginia. Eventually, over 3,000 Mingo County miners would join the union, and they would be fired like right afterwards. And the coal companies would hire agents of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency to evict the families of their former employees. On May 19th, 1920, a dozen Baldwin Felt detectives would begin evicting families, and the first family that they evicted was a woman and her children, as the woman's husband was not home at the time, and they forced them out at gunpoint and threw their belongings in the road. In the rain. And the miners who saw this, they were pissed. So now after this, the agents would walk to the train station to leave the town, and Police Chief Sid Hatfield and a group of deputized miners would confront them and say, "You're under arrest." And Albert Felts would reply and be like, "In fact, I have a warrant for your arrest, Police Chief Hatfield." Dude, they were on some bullshit. The mayor, Mr. Testerman, would be alerted, and Hatfield would back into his store, and Testerman would walk in and be like, "Let me see the warrant." And after looking at it, the mayor would be like, nah, this is a bogus warrant, bro. And right at that moment, people would start shooting. A gunfight would erupt, and Police Chief Hatfield would shoot Albert Felts. The mayor would get killed. Albert Felts and his brother Lee Felts would also get killed. And 2 more men from the town and 5 more from the agency would also be killed. The next year, on January 26, 1921, Police Chief Hatfield would be put on trial for killing Albert Felts, and all the miners there, including him, would be acquitted for it. And around mid-May of 1921, the miners would launch a full-scale assault on non-union mines, and this quote-unquote 3 days battle would eventually end with a flag of truce and the implementation of martial law. And yeah, hundreds of miners would be arrested, and the Union miners would respond with guerrilla tactics and sabotage. Now, amidst all this, Hatfield would travel to McDowell County in August to stand trial for blowing some shit up. And when he got to the courthouse, a group of Baldwin Felts agents standing at the top of the stairs would open fire and shoot and kill Hatfield. Now, of course, this pissed off the United Mine Workers Union, and yeah, there would be a huge battle, and approximately 1 million rounds would be fired. Eventually, the United States Army, represented by the West Virginia Army National Guard, would intervene by presidential order, and that would put an end to all that. In 1921, we'd also get the Tulsa Race Massacre, and what happened was a 19-year-old African-American, Dick Rowland, was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, who was a 17-year-old white woman, and Rowland would be taken into custody, and rumors would spread that he was going to be lynched, and that spread throughout the city. Upon hearing reports that a mob of hundreds of white men had gathered outside the jail where Rowland was being held, a group of around 75 black men, some of whom were armed, would arrive at the jail to ensure that he would not be lynched. The sheriff would attempt to persuade the group to leave the jail, and an elderly white man would approach an African-American man and demand him to hand over his pistol. The African-American man refused, and the white man attempted to disarm him. The white man would then be shot, and 10 white people would be killed and 2 black people would be killed, and then the black people would then retreat to Greenwood, and news of the violence would spread throughout the city, and mobs of white residents, some of whom had been deputized and given weapons by city officials, would then invade Greenwood the next morning, killing men and burning and looting stores and homes. Eventually, Oklahoma National Guard would impose martial law, ending the massacre, and by the end, around 10,000 black people would be left homeless. More than 800 would be admitted to hospitals, and around 300 people would be dead. 2 years later, in 1923, the Russian Civil War would end. The White Army would eventually collapse. There's not really much to say about it. This is U.S. history, bro, not world history. Same year, in 1923, we'd get the Quasi War. This began after 2 young Ute Native Americans robbed a sheep ranch at Cajon Mesa, assaulted the owner, slaughtered a calf, and burned a bridge, and the 2 boys were members of Chief Posey's band. The first was the youngest son of a man named Joe Bishop, and the second was the son of a man named Sanup. The two boys were eventually arrested, and it was demanded that they had a trial that began on March 20th, and Chief Posey and a few of his men would attend the trial to make sure that nothing bad would happen. And then the young man would then grab the reins of the horse that the sheriff was riding and just jerked on the reins as like a way to discombobulate the horse so he could get away. And then the boy would then jump on another horse and start heading north. Now, right after that happened, Chief Posey would flee with his people, and him and his band would go north to the desert around Navajo Mountain. Eventually, a posse would be formed, and they would catch up with Chief Posey's band. The Native Americans, however, would all eventually surrender, and Chief Posey escaped. However, he was wounded by a bullet and would later end up dying from blood poisoning. But yeah, the young Ute that had originally ran off was shot and killed. There's like two conflicting reports. One was that Chief Posey allegedly shot him because he was angry that he had caused so much trouble, and other accounts say that he was just killed by the posse. The next year, in 1924, the U.S. occupation of the Dominican Republic would end. After World War I, public opinion about the United States occupation was getting pretty negative, as Dominican witnesses would argue that the United States government's actions violated international law and that the occupying forces were abusing captives. There was a withdrawal proposal made known as the Harding Plan. And yeah, basically they got the hell up out of there. Now, several years later, in 1933, the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua would end. The Hoover administration would start a United States pullout, and on January 2nd, 1933, Hoover would officially end the American intervention of Nicaragua. A year later, in 1934, the U.S. occupation of Haiti would end, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt had affirmed the August 1933 disengagement agreement, and the last contingent of Marines would depart on August 15, 1934, and there would be a formal transfer of authority to the American-created leadership in Haiti. Now, 7 years later, in 1941, we'd get World War II. Basic rundown. In the European side, Hitler had, of course, risen to power in Germany. It was a storm, and Hitler would eventually invade Poland in 1939. This would then cause Britain and France to declare war. Poland would still be quickly overrun, and Germany would continue to advance east. Now, at this point in the war, in 1940, Germany was fucking shut up. You can't even lie. Like, they invaded Denmark and Norway while advancing through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and eventually even through France. And northern France would eventually become occupied by Germany, who would then use newly occupied sea and airports to start shipping raids on British merchants and air raids over England. In 1941, Germany would then invade Soviet-held portions of Eastern Europe and advance through Belarus and Ukraine and even burning Moscow before stopping at Stalingrad. So yeah, the USSR was like, all right, you want to play like that? So the USSR would then ally with the United Kingdom, and the United States would attempt to remain neutral. However, they would still be dealing weapons and supplies to the Allies. The Japanese would then attack Pearl Harbor, which got the United States officially involved in the war, and Germany would just declare war on the United States after that for for no reason. And from then on, the Allied forces would prevail in the European and Pacific Front. We'd get D-Day, which was the invasion of Normandy and Omaha. The Allied forces landed on Europe. Man, if you want to learn about the European and Pacific Front, just watch Band of Brothers and The Pacific. Bro, both are really good shows, bro, for real. Eventually, in 1945, the Americans would deploy nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japanese surrender. And Allied forces would eventually advance through Germany. In particular, Soviet forces would advance on Berlin and destroy the German resistance. And as this was pretty much an unprecedented war, in an effort to maintain world peace, the Allies would form the United Nations, which officially came into existence on October 24th, 1945. 5 years after the end of World War II, in 1950, we'd get the Korean War, and what happened was Japan had annexed Korea in 1910 and would govern it as a colony until their defeat in World War II. And after World War II, the Soviet Union would occupy the north of the Korean Peninsula and the US would occupy the southern part. Now, after their occupation, they would each set up puppet governments in parts of Korea. And in 1950, North Korea would attack South Korea in an attempt to reunite. After they initially succeeded, they would be almost completely defeated by response of the United States and other United Nations allies. However, China would then intervene on the side of North Korea and help them fight to a stalemate. And after about 3 years, the borders would be completely back to where it started. So after 3 years of fighting, a truce would eventually be signed. Now, in 1953, we'd get the Laotian Civil War, and there was a rivalry between neutralists under Prince Suvarnabhuma and Lao Patriotic Front under Prince Sophan. Bruh, oh my god, I'm sorry, I can't. I'm
South and Alvong.
There was a huge power struggle, and there were even claims that the United States Central Intelligence Agency even had a hand in some of the fighting that was going on between the Laotian Civil War. About 5 years later, in 1958, we get the Lebanon crisis. Lebanon was made up of several tribal factions, including the Maronite Christians, Druze, and the Shiite and Sunni Muslims. And when Lebanon was first created, the majority of the population was Christian, and due to this, Christians were given majority control over the government. And it was an unwritten agreement known as the National Pact that the Lebanese president would always be a Maronite Christian. And Parliament would also contain a 6-to-5 ratio of Christians to Muslim. The Prime Minister would be a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of the Parliament would be a Shiite. Now, this whole setup would be first tested when the President of Lebanon in 1958 would decide to maintain friendly terms with the Western nations despite their attacks on Egypt. And these Western nations specifically were trying to stop coups and prevent communism from spreading. So Lebanon's president would support the Western nations, and Christians would also support the president in his pro-Western views, while Muslims would feel betrayed by this. And civil war would seem imminent until the United States would send a display of force of around 11,000 soldiers in order to scare the Muslims into submission. And that was basically the United States intervention in this. There's a lot more backstory behind this, including the Lebanon Civil War. But this is, maybe for another time. 3 years later, in 1961, we get the Bay of Pigs invasion, and this was an attempt to basically throw Fidel Castro out of power from Cuba. The United States CIA would train Cuban exiles, and those said exiles would launch an attack in the bay called the Bay of Pigs, and the invasion would be a complete failure, which led to most of the attackers being captured or killed. The main reason behind this was the spread and flow of communism. Basically, the United States was mad. In simple versions, in very simple terms, the United States did not want Fidel Castro to team up with the USSR, because that meant that the USSR would be able to store weapons in Cuba, store missiles in Cuba, make shit worse for America. Very bad. The invading force would be defeated within 3 days by the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. This would then solidify Castro's role as a national Cuban hero and would widen the political division between the United States and Cuba. And yeah. Now, 4 years later, in 1965, the Vietnam War would begin. Up until World War II, France had colonies in Asia that they watched over and kind of made money off of. And after World War II would end, France and the United Kingdom would eventually let these colonies be free. Meanwhile, at the time, people in Vietnam, called French Indochina, wanted to be free and started looking for people to help them. They would be encouraged by the Soviet Union to become a communist state. And at this time, the People's Republic of China would be created and become communist as well. And since China was so close, Vietnam would seek help from them. Now, the United States decided that it did not like communism, and it did not like other countries like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China spreading bullshit. And once it became clear that communism would be a possibility in Vietnam, the United States decided to step in, bro. Yeah, and they just stepped in. Same year in 1965, we'd get the Dominican Civil War, and basically Juan Bosch would overthrow the military-installed President Donald Reed Cabral from office, which would then lead to military loyal to President Reed, or loyalists, initiating an armed campaign against the so-called constitutionalist rebels. Allegations of foreign communist support for the loyalists would then lead to the United States intervention in the conflict. A force of 1,700 Marines would eventually be sent to the Dominican Republic, and there'd be a couple small battles, and eventually the whole situation would be quelled, leading to first post-war elections being held on July 1st, 1966. Now, in 1966, the Korean DMZ conflict would also begin. This was like a series of low clashes between North Korean forces and South Korea and the United States at the Korean DMZ. And Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, the supreme leader, believed that he could force a split between the U.S. and South Korea through armed provocations that targeted U.S. forces, and he believed that this would force the U.S. to reassess or relinquish its commitment to South Korea. But yeah, that would begin in 1966. A year later, in 1967, the Cambodian Civil War would begin, and basically it all started out with the North Vietnam's People's Army of Vietnam, or the PAVN, and they were there attempting to protect the base areas and sanctuaries in eastern Cambodia in order to further their military effort in South Vietnam. Their presence was first tolerated by Prince Sihanouk, who was the Cambodian head of state, but eventually domestic resistance combined with China and North Vietnam providing aid to anti-government Khmer Rouge would alarm the prince, and this caused him to go to Moscow, and he talked to the Soviet Union, and he was like, hey man, you gotta chill out, bro. These North Vietnamese, man, they're getting kind of reckless. This would then lead to full-scale protests in Cambodia against the PAVN troops in the country, and Cambodia would eventually put a pro-American government in power, which demanded that the PAVN leave Cambodia. The PAVN would then refuse, and at the request of the Khmer Rouge, they would invade Cambodia, and boom, all this would begin in 1967. 2 years later, in 1969, the Korean DMZ conflict would kind of end. The United States Army divisions were seriously under-equipped and understaffed as the war in Vietnam was still going on. And at this point in time, things kind of settled out. Yeah, kind of. I don't know. Well, I mean, you guys are alive at the same time as me. Tensions would still remain throughout the years, obviously. 5 years later, in 1974, the Vietnam War would end. Yeah, it was a shitty war. There were no clear, actual battle lines, as this was, full of guerrilla warfare, and most of the time, the enemy wasn't even being seen. More specifically, the opposition to the war would rise in the United States, particularly because people had just viewed it as, oh, the North Vietnamese just want their freedom from colonial rule, just like the U.S. in the 1700s. And there was also some sketchy type shit going on, killing civilians and shit, and things were shit, bro. It was bad. I'm not even gonna get into the war crimes because there was a lot, of course, on both sides. And the U.S. President John F. Kennedy would also be assassinated, leading to Lyndon B. Johnson deciding that the country could win the war, but since this was not a war of seizing and holding ground, since the Vietnamese could run away when attacked, it was a guerrilla warfare, it would have to be a war of attrition, which in other words, whoever lost the most people would lose. And the U.S. would begin conducting search and destroy missions and keep a body count to officially prove that they were winning. Eventually, public tide would turn fully against the war, and the United States saw that it would be foolish to continue to supply assets they needed to fight, and they left. That would be the end of that. Now, the next year, in 1975, the Cambodian Civil War would end, and eventually the Republican government would be defeated, and the Khmer Rouge would proclaim the establishment of Democratic Kampuchea. And yeah, up until this point, it was pretty shitty for Cambodia. The United States had bombed the shit out of Cambodia up until this point in their campaign against the Khmer Rouge. After the Khmer Rouge would take over. The Cambodian Genocide would commence, and this would be the systematic persecution and killing of Cambodians by the Khmer Rouge under the leadership of the Communist Party of Kampuchea and the General Secretary Pol Pot. Many of you might know who that is. Yeah, that would result in the deaths of 1.5 to 2 million people, and yeah, that would be the end of the Civil War. Same year, in 1975, the Laotian Civil War would also end. By this point, the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao would emerge victorious in, quote, Indochina, and Hmong rebels would attempt to fight the new government, and they would be completely persecuted as traitors and, quote, lackeys of Americans. And over 40,000 Hmong people would die in the conflict. The Lao royal family would be arrested by the Pathet Lao after the war and sent to labor camps, where most of them would die in the late 1970s and 1980s. Several years later, in 1982, the intervention of Lebanon would begin. And if y'all remember, the origins were between the Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, and the Christians. And there would be fighting between Maronite Christians and Palestinian forces. And Pan-Arabist and Muslim Lebanese groups would eventually ally with the Palestinians. And over the course of fighting, a whole bunch of different alliances would form, and foreign powers, including Israel and Syria, would become involved in the war and fight alongside different factions. And eventually, in 1982, the United States would broker a ceasefire between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Israel, and this ceasefire would hold until June 3rd, 1982, when the Abu Nadal organization would attempt to assassinate Israel's ambassador to London. Israel would then blame the PLO, and then 3 days later they would invade Lebanon, and the multinational force would be deployed in order to assist the Lebanese armed forces in evacuating the PLO, Syrian forces, and other foreign combatants involved in the civil war. That'd be pretty much the end of it. A year later, in 1983, we'd get the invasion of Grenada, and what happened was Grenada had gained their independence from the United Kingdom in 1974, and a communist group called the New Jewel Movement would seize power in a coup in 1979 under the leader named Maurice Bishop. Pretty much everything would erupt in September 1983 when Bishop would agree to meet with Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Accord, and at this meeting Bishop would agree to share power with him, but then he would take it back. He'd agree first, and then he'd be like, nah. Bishop would then be put under house arrest by his own Central Party's committee. When Bishop's followers heard about his arrest, he would be freed by a crowd, and this would lead to a confrontation at military headquarters between Grenadian soldiers that were loyal to Accord and civilians that were supporting Bishop, and at least 19 soldiers and civilians would be killed, including Bishop. There would then be a formal appeal for help submitted by the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and the Reagan administration in the U.S. would launch a military intervention. The invasion would begin on October 25th, 1983, in which the invading forces would defeat the Grenadian resistance, and a governor general would be in charge until Grenada's elections in 1984. The next year, in 1984, the intervention of Lebanon would end. The United States would pretty much not be involved in the conflict at this point, and eventually in 1989, the Taif Agreement would mark the beginning of the end of the fighting, and a committee appointed by the Arab League would begin to formulate solutions to the conflict. And by May 1991, the militias would be completely dissolved. However, religious tensions would still remain between Sunnis and the Shiites. Now, in 1986, we'd get the bombing of Libya. On April 5th, 1986, 3 people would be killed and 200 would be injured after an entertainment venue in West Berlin would be bombed. Apparently, this venue was commonly full of United States soldiers, and 2 of the dead and 79 of the injured were Americans. And eventually, Libya would be accused by the U.S. government of actually sponsoring the bombing, and the United States President Ronald Reagan at the time would order strikes in retaliation on Tripoli and Benghazi in Libya 10 days later. And this operation was seen as an attempt to kill Gaddafi. Y'all know who that is. It's Gaddafi. However, a year later in 1987, Manfred Ganschau, the head of the West German team investigating the bombing, said that there was no evidence pointing the finger at Libya. And eventually in 2001, Gaddafi would actually be absolved of responsibility of the bombing. And the bombing of Libya would result in 40 reported Libyan casualties, and 1 U.S. plane would be shot down. The next year in 1987, we get the Tanker War, which was just a small series of armed skirmishes between Iran and Iraq against merchant vessels in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. And this was a small conflict that was a part of the Iran-Iraq War. And the United States would eventually intervene in this conflict in 1986 to protect Kuwaiti tankers and would subsequently engage in confrontation with Iran. Now, 2 years later, in 1989, we'd get the invasion of Panama. They could deadass make a whole movie off of everything that preceded this. But what you gotta know is CIA, Noriega, they were doing some sketchy shit. Noriega, who was the general and assumed control over Panama's armed forces, was a key broker in the CIA's effort to back Nicaraguan Contras. He also supplied intelligence on back-channel communications with Cuba to the CIA. It was just sketchy. He rigged presidential elections, and all the while tensions were just rising between Panama and the United States. Noriega would eventually become the country's official head of state, and yeah, he had a very militant type of rule. Apparently, one of the last straws would be when 4 U.S. soldiers and a civilian tried to get past a Panamanian roadblock, and the Panamanians would open fire, killing a passenger and wounding the driver, and a U.S. Navy officer and his wife who witnessed the attack would be arrested, and the officer would be beaten, and his wife would be sexually harassed. President Bush would give the order to execute Operation Just Cause, in which thousands of U.S. soldiers would be brought into Panama, and Noriega would eventually surrender to the U.S. in 1990. Now, in 1990, we get Desert Storm, or the Gulf War, and this basically happened in August 1990 when the Iraqi army invaded and occupied Kuwait, which was met with international condemnation, and people brought immediate economic sanctions on them, bro. Sanctions, hit them with sanctions, man. U.S. President at the time, George H.W. Bush, would deploy forces into Saudi Arabia and urge other countries to do the same, and an array of nations would eventually join the coalition, forming the largest military alliance since World War II. Yeah, the coalition forces would eventually liberate Kuwait and advance in the Iraqi territory, and then cease the advance and declare a ceasefire about 100 hours after the official ground campaign started. And yeah, that was pretty much the end of that. Now, starting in 1991, Iraqi no-fly zone operations would begin, and this was just a low-level conflict in Iraq proclaimed by the United States, United Kingdom, and France after the Gulf War, and it was stated that these no-fly zones were intended to protect the ethnic Kurdish minority in northern Iraq and Shiite Muslims in the south. Any Iraqi aircraft were forbidden from flying inside the zones. The next year, in 1992, we'd get the U.S. intervention in the Somalia Civil War would begin. And in the previous years, Somali armed forces would begin engaging in combat with various armed rebel groups, including the Somali Salvation Democratic Front in the northeast, Somali National Movement in the northwest, and the United Somali Congress in the south. Eventually, the opposition groups would overthrow the Barre government in 1991, and that would lead to various armed factions to start competing for control in the power vacuum. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 794 would be unanimously passed on December 3rd, 1992, and UN peacekeepers would officially land in 1993. And from this whole situation, we'd get the Battle of Mogadishu, or as most people may know it as the Black Hawk Down incident. About a couple years later, in 1994, we get the intervention in Haiti, and basically what had happened, the ex-president there, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was overthrown in a coup by a military regime installed by General Joseph Raoul Cedras. So the United States issued an ultimatum to the dictator, and his choices were to either recognize the wish of the Haitian people as expressed through democratic election of Jean-Bertrand and retire, or continue to deny the election's outcome, in which case the U.S. would then forcibly seize control of the country and see justice done. The general was like, all right, you got it. And this whole planned invasion, which was called Operation Uphold Democracy, would officially end March 31st, 1995. Now, in 1995, the U.S. intervention in the Somali Civil War would end. At this point, Somali principals had some success in reconciliation and establishment of public authorities, and there was even a peace agreement between Adid's forces and the SSDF, and U.S. involvement would be pretty much over by this point, and UN soldiers would eventually withdraw from the country in 1995. In 1995, we'd also get the Bosnian-Croatian War intervention. Basically, in Yugoslavia, Croatians and Muslims were fighting together against Serbians, and Serbians would eventually agree to split Bosnia up, and this would leave the Muslims out, and they would be stuck fighting for their lives. It was a very ethnic war, and the United States would intervene with Operation Deliberate Force, which was a sustained air campaign conducted by NATO and the United Nations Protection Force to undermine the military capability of the Republika Srpska, who were threatening and actually attacked UN-designated safe areas in Bosnia. The operation will be carried out between August 30th and September 20th. Around 338 Bosnian Serbian targets would be struck, and overall 1,000 bombs will be dropped during the operation. About 4 years later, in 1999, we'd get the Kosovo War intervention, and this all started because the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was literally killing Albanians in like an ethnic cleansing during the Kosovo War. This pissed off a lot of organizations, including the UN, NATO, and various INGOs. NATO countries would eventually attempt to gain authorization from the UN Security Council for military action, but they would be opposed by China and Russia. And as a result, NATO was like, bro, that we don't need we don't need your permission. So they launched their own campaign without the UN's approval, stating that it was a humanitarian intervention. They would then launch airstrikes that lasted from March to June in 1999, and the bombings would continue until an agreement was reached that led to the withdrawal of Yugoslav armed forces from Kosovo. Now, 2 years later, in 2001, the war in Afghanistan would begin, and following the September 11th attacks in 2001, the United States President George W. Bush would demand that the Taliban, who is the group currently ruling Afghanistan, extradite Osama bin Laden, the assumed mastermind of the attacks, and the Taliban would refuse, and this led to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Now, in 2002, we'd get the U.S. intervention in Yemen, and following the September 11, 2001 attacks, U.S. military would start attacking the Islamist militant presence in Yemen, particularly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, using drone warfare. Now, it's insisted that the U.S. first started using targeted killing in November of 2002 with the cooperation and approval of the Yemeni government, but an estimated of 98 U.S. drone attacks would be conducted from 2002 to 2015. The next year, in 2003, the Iraqi no-fly zone operations would end, and this would officially cease to exist, beginning the Iraq War in March 2003, which we're about to get into now. Boom, 2003, the war in Iraq would begin, and this would all basically begin when the Bush administration administered its rationale for the Iraq War, claiming that Iraq had, quote, weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq posed a threat to the United States and its allies. And there were even claims that Saddam Hussein himself was harboring and supporting Al-Qaeda. So yeah, we'd invade Iraq in 2003. And not to say, I mean, yes, things were very sketchy to begin with, especially on the United States government side. But I don't want y'all to think that Saddam Hussein himself was an innocent man. Bro was a well-known ethnic cleanser. The next year in 2004, we get the intervention of the war in Pakistan, and this was basically a series of drone strikes, and has also been called the Drone War against Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State or ISIS in Pakistan. And eventually in 2013 of December, the National Assembly of Pakistan would unanimously approve a resolution against U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan, calling them a violation of the Charter of the United Nations, international laws, and humanitarian norms. A couple years later, in 2007, we'd get the second U.S. intervention in the Somali Civil War. And following the global war on terrorism that began in 2001, this was just the action of hundreds of drone strikes targeting the terrorist group Al-Shabaab in Somalia. 2 years later, in 2009, Operation Ocean Shield would begin, and this was just NATO's contribution to an anti-piracy initiative in the Indian Ocean, and the U.S. Navy would be the largest contributor of ships towards this operation, followed by the Indian Navy. A couple years later, in 2011, the war in Iraq would end, and yeah, you guys know we'd capture Saddam Hussein, right? You know we'd get him, right? We got him.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Eventually, Iraq would hold multi-party elections in 2005, and they'd elect a prime minister in 2006 who would remain in office in 2014. And yeah, that'd be pretty much the end of that, man. Oh yeah, and I forgot to add that the FBI would interrogate Saddam Hussein, and they would confirm that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction prior to the U.S. invasion. So, same year in 2011, we'd get the intervention in Libya, and at the time, there was a Libyan civil war going on between those loyal to Gaddafi and rebel groups that were seeking to remove him from power. And the UN Security Council would vote to have an immediate ceasefire in Libya and end the current attacks against civilians, which were constituted as crimes against humanity. So American and British naval forces would arrive and fire over 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles, while the French Air Force, British Royal Air Force, and Royal Canadian Air Force would set up a no-fly zone. This intervention did not employ a single foreign ground troop. Eventually, Gaddafi would be killed by the rebels, and yeah, that would be the end of that. In 2011, Operation Observant Compass would also begin, and this was a United States effort that initially focused on apprehending Joseph Kony, if y'all remember him. Y'all remember Kony, bro? I remember seeing him in the news when I was a kid. Straight up disappeared, though, bro. Yeah, and this whole operation was overseen by the United States Africa Command. A couple years later, in 2014, U.S. intervention in Iraq would begin, and this would be due to the Islamic State beginning its offensive on northern Iraq, and the United States would start supplying Kurdish forces with weapons, and they would also begin airstrikes against Islamic State positions in Iraq. In 2014, we'd also get the U.S. intervention in Syria, which was basically the American-led support of Syrian rebels and Syrian Democratic Forces against the Islamic State in Syria and Al-Qaeda. Simple as that. Yeah. Another conflict which included a lot of airstrikes and aircraft. Alright, so we're basically at the end of this, so I'm about to speed run this real quick. Alright, next year in 2015, the U.S. intervention of Libya would begin, and this would just be a series of airstrikes and drone strikes to assist in Libya against the Islamic State presence. Next year in 2016, Operation Ocean Shield would end. Yeah, this was just to prevent piracy, pretty much, and NATO would then begin to reallocate its resources to the Mediterranean and deal with the immigrant crisis and human smuggling. Next year in 2017, by this point, around $800 million would be spent on the operation looking for Kony, and bro, they still haven't found them, have they? That man is still in hiding, or maybe the man doesn't even exist. I don't know. It's considered that the operation didn't completely disband as military efforts transitioned into a broader scope of security and stability with African partners. 2 years later, in 2019, the U.S. intervention in Libya would end, and by then the Islamic State branch there had been largely driven out from Libya territory, and U.S. drone strikes would end. 2 years later, in 2021, the second U.S. intervention in the Somali Civil War would end, and in late 2020, U.S. President Donald Trump would announce that he would pull most troops out of Somalia by January 15th, 2021. And when January 17th, 2021 came around, the U.S. military would announce that the troop withdrawal had been completed. However, training of allied forces, limited airstrikes, and special operation activities still continue. Same year, in 2021, the U.S. intervention of Iraq would end. And despite the U.S. objections, the Iraqi parliament would still demand that U.S. troops withdraw in January 2020 following the deaths of multiple Iraqi officials in a U.S. airstrike, and the coalition would officially conclude its combat mission in Iraq in December 2021. And last but not least, in 2021, the war in Afghanistan would end. By this point, we had killed Osama bin Laden in 2011, and in 2020, the United States and the Taliban would sign a conditional peace deal which required that the U.S. troops withdraw by April 2021, and the Taliban in return would pledge to prevent any group in the territory of Afghanistan from attacking the U.S. and its allies in the future. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Holy shit, dude. That was a long ass fucking video, bruh. Oh my god. Anyways, war is shit, bro. And I think it could be said that a lot of things and good things have been done in the name of the United States when it comes to certain situations in war. At times there's no ultimate good or bad side, which makes things really shitty. And I don't know. I mean, at least I can live in a country where I have the right to talk about this shit without worrying about, you know, being executed. But I don't know. I think after this you could definitely see that there's certain points of history that definitely need to be taught, because we're supposed to learn from it in order to keep, you know, certain events from not happening again. Anyways, a lot of y'all been wondering when the next gang documentary is gonna be made. I got y'all. I'm still working on it, bro. The next one's gonna be about New York, and following that video, I'm probably gonna stick to making one of those like once a year, bro. To be honest, that shit is draining as fuck, bro. Like, even this is probably gonna be like my, I don't know. That's not what I want my channel to be about. If y'all want to, hold up, let me do this right this time. Trap Lord Ross, bruh. I genuinely had no idea who he was at the time, bro. Like, to me, he was just some British guy. And I was like, whoa, how the fuck does he know so much about what the fuck's going on in America? And I thought it was weird. Look, bro, if y'all want to be consistently updated on gang culture, his channel is a good channel for that. Chicago scene, alright. Just don't put fucking 20 ads in a video, bruh. It's all jokes, bruh. It's all jokes, alright? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. At the moment of me recording this shit, we just hit 5,000 subscribers, and I want to let y'all know that I'm extremely grateful for that. Like it means a lot to me, for real. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you in the next one.